It was a warm spring evening, and we had the windows down in my old Chevy as we parked at the end of the gravel road. The area was wooded, with steep hills rising up on either side. As the sun set, we started making out in the front seat, lost in our own little world. I don't know how much time had passed when I first sensed something wasn't right. It was like a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I pulled away from my girlfriend and glanced out the windshield, my eyes straining in the twilight. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet in front of the car stood this thing. My brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing at first. It was huge, at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller, and it was covered in dark, matted hair or fur. But the proportions were all wrong for a bear or any other animal I'd ever seen. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out more details. It had a vaguely human-like shape, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The head was large and slightly pointed, set directly on broad shoulders with barely any neck, and the face— God, the face. It was like a nightmarish blend of ape and human features, with deep-set eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. I froze, my arm still around my girlfriend. She must have sensed my tension because she looked up at me with a confused expression. Then she followed my gaze and let out a strangled gasp. The creature was swaying slightly from side to side, but its eyes were locked on us. I had the sickening feeling that it was studying us, trying to figure out what we were. My girlfriend started trembling and whimpering softly. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't find my voice. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Us in the car, paralyzed with fear, and this impossible being on the road in front of us. Then it took a halting step towards the vehicle. That broke the spell. My girlfriend screamed and I fumbled for the keys in the ignition, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped them on the floor. As I bent to retrieve them, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I looked up just in time to see the creature lurch forward, covering half the distance to the car in a single bound. Its movements were unnaturally fluid and quick for something so large. Panic exploded in my chest. We were trapped. In that moment, some primal instinct took over. Maybe it was adrenaline or maybe just blind terror, but I found myself throwing open the car door and leaping out to confront this monster. I was in great shape back then, captain of my college rugby team, working out 5 days a week. But as soon as my feet hit the gravel, I knew I was hopelessly outmatched. The thing pivoted to face me, and I got my first clear look at its eyes. They were pitch black and soulless, like looking into empty space. A wave of cold dread washed over me. This wasn't just some undiscovered animal. There was an intelligence there, an otherworldly malevolence that made me feel small and helpless. I must have hesitated for just a second, but it was enough. The creature's mouth opened in a snarl, revealing rows of yellowed, pointed teeth. Then it spun with impossible speed and bounded off into the woods. I stood there, heart pounding, as the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves faded into the distance. My girlfriend was sobbing in the car. I wanted to chase after it, to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing, but my legs felt like jelly, and a part of me was terrified of what I might find if I actually caught up to it. We drove home in silence, both too shaken to speak. Over the next few days, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, or some sick prank by someone in a costume. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. I spent hours researching online, trying to find anything that matched what we encountered. That's when I first came across accounts of Bigfoot sightings. A lot of the descriptions were eerily similar to what we saw: the height, the hair, the inhuman speed and agility. But there was one key difference that always nagged at me. Nearly every Bigfoot report mentioned a strong, skunky odor. We never smelled anything that night. And the eyes. Most stories described them as being reddish or amber-colored. What we saw had eyes like black holes. It's been 16 years since that night, and I still don't know what to make of it. Was it really Bigfoot, some other cryptid, or something even stranger? I've never been able to fully shake the feeling that we glimpsed something that shouldn't exist in our world. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the forests of Idaho. Other times I try to convince myself it was all just a bizarre hallucination brought on by fear and darkness. But then I'll catch my girlfriend's eye. We're married now, and I know she saw it too. That shared experience, as terrifying as it was, formed an unbreakable bond between us. We've never gone back to that spot. We moved away from Lewiston a few years later, partly to pursue job opportunities, but if I'm honest, partly to put some distance between us and those woods. I still love the outdoors, still go camping and hiking, but I'm always a little more alert now, always scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking silhouette watching me from the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what happened that night. Maybe it's better that way. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. But I know what I saw, what we both saw. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and dark, I still hear that inhuman growl echoing in my memories. Story 2. The first few days of the trek were uneventful. We hiked through beautiful alpine meadows and dense forests, setting up camp each evening in picturesque spots. The dogs and goats seemed to be enjoying the journey as much as I was. But on the fourth night, everything changed. We had set up camp in a secluded meadow, surrounded by thick forest. As dusk approached, I noticed the animals starting to act strangely. The dogs became restless, pacing back and forth and whining softly. The goats huddled together, their eyes darting nervously. At first, I dismissed it as them being on edge from unfamiliar nighttime sounds in the wilderness, but as darkness fell, their agitation only increased. I tried to calm them down, but nothing seemed to work. An eerie silence had fallen over the forest, no sounds of birds or insects, just an oppressive quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As night fully set in, I reluctantly crawled into my tent, leaving the dogs and goats tethered nearby. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of unease. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me flinch. After what felt like hours, I finally started to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a deep, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The dogs erupted into frenzied barking, and the goats began bleating in terror. Heart pounding, I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, I saw a massive, fur-covered figure looming just behind my tent. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with a broad, muscular frame covered in thick brown fur. But what struck me most were its eyes, deep brown and uncannily intelligent, staring directly at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Time seemed to stand still as the creature and I locked eyes. A small part of my brain registered that this must be the legendary Bigfoot, but that realization was overwhelmed by sheer terror and awe at the imposing being before me. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. Then it let out a low, rumbling sound that resonated through my entire body. I could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath me. In that moment, I was certain my life was about to end, that this beast would tear me limb from limb. But to my utter shock, it didn't attack. Instead, it slowly turned its massive head, looking off to the side. Following its gaze, I saw the shadowy outline of a second, equally large creature emerging from the tree line. The two Bigfoot creatures regarded each other for a moment, communicating through a series of low grunts and whoops. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the forest. The ground trembled slightly as they lumbered away, branches snapping under their weight. Within seconds, they had vanished completely, leaving no trace behind. I sat there frozen for what felt like hours, flashlight beam still trained on the spot where the creatures had stood. My mind struggled to process what I had just witnessed. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and darkness had caused me to hallucinate. But the terror I felt was all too real. As the adrenaline began to subside, I became aware of my surroundings again. The dogs had gone quiet, huddled together and whimpering softly. The goats were still bleating, but less frantically now. The oppressive silence from earlier had lifted, replaced by the normal nighttime sounds of the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat wide awake, jumping at every sound, convinced the creatures would return at any moment. As the first light of dawn broke, I hastily packed up camp. The animals seemed eager to leave as well, practically pulling me down the trail in their haste to get away from that meadow. The rest of the trek passed in a blur. I cut the trip short, heading back to civilization as quickly as possible. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, constantly looking over my shoulder and startling at any movement in the trees. It's been years since that night, but the memory is seared into my mind. I've never been able to fully explain or understand what I saw. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters, but none quite match my experience. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the isolation and darkness played tricks on my mind. But then I remember those intelligent brown eyes staring into mine, and I know it was real. I haven't been back to that part of Colorado since. I still enjoy hiking and camping, but never alone and never in such remote areas. The encounter left me with a deep respect for the mysteries of nature and the realization that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. To this day, I'm haunted by questions. Why didn't the creatures attack? Were they simply curious about me? Was there some kind of intelligence or intent behind their actions? I'll probably never know the answers. But one thing's for certain. I'll never forget that night in the Colorado wilderness when I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. The experience changed me profoundly. It shook my understanding of reality and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I've become more open-minded about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. But I've also developed a heightened sense of caution in the wilderness, always aware that there might be something watching from just beyond the tree line. I've debated for years whether to share this story publicly. Part of me worried people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But I feel compelled to tell others what I saw, in case it helps shed light on the Bigfoot mystery. I know what I experienced was real, even if I can't explain it. So that's my story. The night I encountered Bigfoot in the Colorado wilderness. It may sound unbelievable, but I swear on everything I hold dear that it's the truth. I'll never forget those eyes, that deep rumbling sound, or the mixture of terror and awe I felt in that moment. Whatever those creatures were, they were real, and they're out there somewhere, in the vast wilderness, waiting to be discovered. Story 3. October 26th started like any other graveyard shift. We arrived around midnight to start prepping dough and firing up the fryers. The sweet smell of sugar and frying oil filled the air as we chatted and worked. Around 3 a.m., we took our usual coffee break, stepping out front for some fresh air. The street was dead quiet, streetlights casting an eerie glow on the empty sidewalks. As we sipped our coffee, movement down the block caught my eye. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks, but then I saw it clearly. A massive, hairy figure lumbering down Main Street. My coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the sidewalk. Jake jumped at the sound, then followed my gaze. His eyes went wide as saucers. "Holy shit," he whispered. "Are you seeing this?" I nodded, unable to form words. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur. But the way it moved, it wasn't the awkward shambling you'd expect from something so large. Its gait was smooth, almost graceful. As it passed under a streetlight, I got a better look. The fur was thick, but not matted. It had an almost silky quality to it. The creature's arms were long, hanging below its knees. Its head was somewhat cone-shaped, sitting directly on broad, sloping shoulders. I was frozen in place, heart pounding. Part of me wanted to run inside and lock the door, but a stronger part was utterly transfixed. I couldn't look away. The creature showed no sign it had noticed us. It continued its leisurely stroll down Main, heading toward the 24-hour car wash at the end of the block. As it neared the car wash, a police cruiser turned onto the street. My breath caught in my throat. Surely the officer would see it. What would happen then? The patrol car slowed as it approached the creature. I saw the dome light come on as the officer leaned forward, peering through the windshield. Then the cruiser's brakes squealed as it came to an abrupt stop. For a long moment, nothing happened. The creature kept walking. The police car sat motionless. Then the driver's door flew open and Officer Miller stumbled out. Even from a distance, I could see the shock on his face. He fumbled for his flashlight, training the beam on the creature's retreating form. The light glinted off its fur, giving it an otherworldly sheen. Officer Miller took a hesitant step forward, then another. The creature must have sensed his approach. It stopped and slowly turned its massive head. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I saw Officer Miller recoil. He scrambled backward, nearly falling as he retreated to his cruiser. The creature regarded him for another moment, then resumed its walk. It rounded the corner by the car wash and disappeared from view. Officer Miller sat in his patrol car for several minutes, head in his hands. Eventually he collected himself and drove away, but not before casting one last disbelieving look in the direction the creature had gone. Jake and I stood in stunned silence for a long while after that. Eventually we went back inside, but neither of us could focus on work. We kept glancing out the windows, half expecting, dreading, hoping to see the creature return. When our relief showed up at 6 a.m., we didn't know what to say. How could we possibly explain what we'd witnessed? We mumbled something about a weird night and headed home. I tossed and turned all day, unable to sleep. The image of that creature was burned into my mind, its fluid movements, its impossible size, the way the streetlights gleamed on its fur. It didn't seem real, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't imagined it. That evening, I stopped by the police station before my shift. I wanted to talk to Officer Miller to confirm that he'd seen it too, but the desk sergeant said he'd called in sick, something he apparently never did. Over the next few days, Jake and I tried to piece together what had happened. We scoured the local paper, but there was no mention of any strange sightings. We asked around town, but no one else seemed to have seen anything unusual that night. About a week later, Officer Miller came into the shop for coffee. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. When I worked up the courage to ask if he'd seen anything strange lately, he went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said gruffly, "and if you know what's good for you, you won't talk about it either." He left without his coffee, and I never saw him in the shop again. I heard through the grapevine that he quit the force not long after and moved away. Jake and I made a pact not to discuss that night, but sometimes, when we worked late shifts together, I'd catch him glancing nervously out the windows. I knew he was looking for it too. Years have passed, but I've never forgotten that night. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and always wondered if that's what we saw. But none of the descriptions quite match up to the creature I encountered. Its graceful movements, its rich red-brown fur, its sheer presence. It was like nothing I've read about or seen since. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember Officer Miller's face, the terror in his eyes. Whatever we saw that night was real. I still live in Florence, though I left that donut shop job long ago. Some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself driving down Main Street in the early morning hours. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse of that extraordinary creature, but mostly I'm grateful I only encountered it once. Because while it didn't act aggressively that night, the power and otherworldliness it radiated was terrifying. It was a stark reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation and challenge everything we think we know. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was afraid people would think I was crazy. But as I get older, I feel a need to share what I saw. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night in Florence, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 4. I was at an off-road motorcycle event near Livingston Falls. The whole area was buzzing with the sound of engines revving and tires kicking up dirt. I love riding, but sometimes you need a break from all the noise and adrenaline. So I decided to take my dog, Max, for a walk in the nearby woods to clear my head. It was a beautiful summer day, blue skies, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Max and I found a nice clearing in the forest, far enough away from the event that the sounds of motorcycles faded into the background. I was enjoying the peace and quiet, watching Max sniff around and explore. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears. But then I heard it again, a high-pitched whimpering sound, almost like a baby crying. It didn't sound quite human, though. My first thought was that it must be a bear cub. We were in bear country, after all, and I knew cubs sometimes wandered away from their mothers. I froze, suddenly on high alert. Where there's a cub, there's usually a protective mama bear not far behind. I whistled for Max to come back to me, not wanting him to stumble upon a potentially dangerous situation. He trotted over, ears perked up. He had clearly heard the sound, too. I scanned the tree line, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. That's when I saw it. About 900 meters away, partially obscured by some bushes, was a dark figure. At first glance, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but something wasn't quite right. As I squinted to get a better look, I realized the figure was covered in black fur or hair, but its shape was all wrong for a bear. It was too thin, too upright. And then it moved. I'll never forget the way it walked. On two legs, just like a person, but not quite like any person I've ever seen. Its gait was awkward, almost like a toddler taking its first steps. But this was no toddler. I estimated it to be between 5 and 6 feet tall and easily 200-300 pounds. My blood ran cold as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be what I thought it was. Those were just stories, myths. But as I stood there, rooted to the spot, I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. The creature, I hesitate to call it that, but I don't know what else to say, moved slowly across the clearing. Its arms swung at its sides, too long for its body. The black hair covering it was matted and shaggy. I couldn't make out any distinct facial features from that distance, but I swear I saw the glint of eyes looking in my direction. Max was standing stock still beside me, which was completely out of character for him. Normally, he'd be barking his head off at any strange animal, but he was dead silent, just watching. I could feel him trembling slightly against my leg. I don't know how long I stood there watching. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 15 seconds. The creature lumbered across the clearing and then disappeared into the thick underbrush on the other side. Just like that, it was gone. I remained frozen in place for several minutes after it vanished, straining my ears for any sound of it moving through the forest. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of birds and wind in the trees. Finally, I snapped out of my daze and looked down at Max. He was staring up at me with wide eyes, as if to say, "Did you see that too?" I patted his head, my hand shaking. "Come on, boy," I muttered. "Let's get out of here." We hurried back to the campsite where the motorcycle event was being held. My mind was racing the whole time. Should I tell someone what I saw? Would anyone believe me? I kept expecting to turn around and see the creature following us, but the forest remained still and empty. When we got back, everything was normal. People were laughing, talking about the day's races, completely oblivious to what had just happened in the woods nearby. I asked a few folks if they had seen or heard anything strange, but no one had. They all looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to describe what I'd witnessed. After a while, I started to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe it was just a bear and my imagination had run wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The image of that creature walking on two legs was burned into my memory. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound from the forest made me jump. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of undiscovered primate? A person in a costume? But who would be wandering around the woods in a fursuit in the middle of August? The next morning, I went back to the clearing, half hoping to find some evidence of what I'd seen. Footprints, broken branches, anything. But there was nothing. The forest looked completely undisturbed. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've read every book and article I could find about Bigfoot sightings, hoping to find something that matched my experience. Some details line up. The height, the black fur, the bipedal movement. But most Bigfoot reports describe fully grown, massive creatures. What I saw seemed smaller, younger somehow, like a juvenile. The more I've thought about it over the years, the more convinced I've become that what I saw was a young Sasquatch. I know how crazy that sounds. Trust me, I've struggled with it for decades. But I know what I saw. I've never told this story publicly before. I was afraid people would think I was nuts or attention-seeking. But I'm older now, and I don't care as much what others think. I know what I experienced was real, even if I can't explain it. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen something similar in those woods. Was it a one-time thing? Or does this creature, or others like it, still roam those forests? I've thought about going back, trying to find it again. But honestly, I'm not sure I want to. That encounter shook me to my core, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to face something like that again. So I'm sharing my story now, hoping that maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Or maybe someone can offer an explanation that I haven't thought of. All I know is that what I saw that day in August 1996 changed my entire view of the world and what might be possible. I still ride motorcycles, still love being outdoors, but I never go into the woods alone anymore. And whenever I'm in a forest, I can't help but scan the trees, half expecting to see that dark, fur-covered figure again. So far, I haven't. But the memory of that day haunts me still, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Story 5. My buddy Tom and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. We were both experienced hikers, but neither of us was prepared for what we encountered on that warm August afternoon. We'd been on the trail for a few hours, chatting and enjoying the stunning mountain scenery. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until it wasn't. I remember the exact moment when the atmosphere shifted. The forest suddenly went eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. It was like someone had hit a mute button on nature itself. Tom and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something felt off. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a growl, but deeper and more human. My heart started racing. Tom whispered, "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, we saw movement in the trees about 50 yards ahead. At first I thought it was a bear, but as the massive shape emerged onto the trail, I realized we were dealing with something far stranger. The creature was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't just the size that shocked me. There was an uncanny intelligence in its eyes as it stared directly at us. I've seen plenty of wildlife, but I'd never encountered an animal that looked at me with such awareness. It was unsettling. For a split second, we all just stood there, frozen. Then the creature let out a horrifying roar that seemed to shake the entire forest. Tom yelled, "Run!" and we both took off down the trail as fast as our legs could carry us. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding behind us as we ran. The thing was fast, impossibly fast for its size. Adrenaline surged through me as pure terror took over. I didn't dare look back. We sprinted for what felt like an eternity, lungs burning, branches whipping our faces. Eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, and we collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. As we caught our breath, Tom and I tried to process what we'd just seen. That wasn't a bear," Tom panted. I nodded, still too winded to speak. We both knew we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. After a few minutes, we got to our feet on shaky legs. We needed to get back to our campsite and get the hell out of there. But as we started walking, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Massive footprints in the soft dirt of the trail. They were easily 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, and they were deep. In some muddy spots, the prints sank 3 inches into the ground. Whatever we saw was heavy, but it got weirder. As we continued, I realized there were 2 distinct sets of tracks. "Tom," I said, my voice shaking, "I think there might be more than one of these things out here." He nodded grimly. I was thinking the same thing. "Did you notice how the sound seemed to be coming from different directions when it was chasing us?" A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was right. During our panicked flight, the crashing and roaring had seemed to surround us at times. We weren't just dealing with one monster, there were at least 2. We picked up our pace, eager to get back to some semblance of civilization. But we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Neither of us wanted to be out here after dark. Who knew what other creatures might be lurking in the wilderness? As we hurried along, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. What exactly had we seen? Some undiscovered species, a creature from native folklore come to life. I'd always scoffed at stories of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but now I wasn't so sure. We finally made it back to our campsite just as dusk was falling. Without a word, we quickly packed up our gear. There was no way in hell we were spending the night out here. The hike back to the trailhead in the fading light was tense. Every shadow seemed to conceal a hulking figure ready to pounce. I've never been so glad to see a parking lot in my life. Once we were safely in the car, the reality of what we'd experienced started to sink in. Tom and I sat in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. "We can't tell anyone about this," Tom finally said. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded in agreement. Who would believe our story? We had no proof beyond our own testimony, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that what we saw was real. In the years since, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and other strange encounters in the wilderness. I've read countless similar accounts from all over North America. It's made me realize that there's still so much we don't understand about the natural world. I've never gone public with my story until now. But I think it's important to share these experiences, even if some people won't believe them. There are things out there that defy explanation. I know, because I've seen them with my own eyes. That day in Jasper changed my entire worldview. I still love nature and go hiking when I can. But I'll never again feel truly alone in the wilderness. There's always a part of me that's on alert, scanning the trees for any sign of those massive, intelligent creatures. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what Tom and I encountered that August afternoon. But I do know this. There are mysteries in this world far beyond what most people realize. And sometimes those mysteries find you when you least expect it. To this day, the sound of that inhuman roar still haunts my dreams. The memory of those piercing, too intelligent eyes still makes me shudder. I can't explain what we saw out there, but I know it was real, and I know we were lucky to escape with our lives. So next time you're out in the wilderness, enjoying the beauty of nature, just remember, you may not be as alone out there as you think. There are things lurking in the shadows of the forest that most people can't even imagine. I've seen them, and I'll never forget. Story 6. As we cruised down the deserted highway, our headlights barely cutting through the darkness, I had this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something just felt off, you know. I kept peering out into the night, searching for, I don't even know what. Just anything out of the ordinary, I guess. Suddenly, Stuart slammed on the brakes, nearly sending me through the windshield. "What the hell, man?" I yelled, heart pounding. But then I saw it too. There, illuminated in our headlights, was something I still can't fully explain to this day. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, if not more, covered in dark brown, matted fur from head to toe. At first glance, I thought it might be a bear, but no. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs. Its movements were unnaturally fluid and graceful for something so large. Time seemed to stand still as we watched this creature lope across the road in front of us. I remember being struck by how fast it moved, despite its size. In probably 30 seconds or less, it had crossed the entire width of the highway and disappeared into the tree line on the other side. The whole time, it never once looked our way. It was like we didn't even exist to this thing, just single-mindedly focused on getting where it was going. I glanced over at Stuart, and the look of shock and disbelief on his face mirrored exactly how I felt. We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Finally, Stuart spoke up. Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find my own voice just yet. "What the fuck was that thing, Jack?" Stuart demanded, a slight edge of hysteria creeping into his tone. I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd just witnessed. "I don't know, man. I honestly don't know." We debated turning around and getting the hell out of there, but something compelled us to investigate further. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe we just needed to prove to ourselves that we weren't going crazy. Slowly, cautiously, we got out of the truck. The biting cold hit me like a slap in the face, momentarily shocking me out of my daze. We trudged through the snow to where the creature had crossed, searching for any signs of its passing. To our amazement, there were footprints. Huge, unmistakably bipedal footprints pressed deep into the snow. They were easily twice the size of my own boot prints. Seeing those tracks made it all real in a way that sent chills down my spine. We followed the prints to the edge of the woods, but stopped short of actually entering. The darkness between the trees seemed to press in on us, and every snapping twig or rustling branch had us jumping out of our skin. "Let's get out of here," Stuart muttered, and I couldn't have agreed more. We practically ran back to the truck, our imaginations conjuring images of that thing lurking just out of sight, watching us. The rest of the drive home was tense and quiet. We were both lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. But deep down, I think we both knew this wasn't something that could be easily explained away. In the days and weeks that followed, Stuart and I talked about that night countless times. We went over every detail, questioning our own memories and perceptions. But no matter how many times we dissected the experience, we always came back to the same conclusion. What we saw out there on Route 40 was real, and it was unlike anything either of us had ever encountered before. We did some research, read up on local legends and cryptid sightings in the area. And yeah, I'll admit it, we started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, we'd had an encounter with the legendary Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before that night, I would have laughed it off as complete bullshit. But when you see something like that with your own eyes, it changes you. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. We debated whether or not to report our sighting. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? We'd probably just be laughed out of town or labeled as attention-seeking kooks. But I think about that night often. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that massive, fur-covered figure burned into my mind. I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm driving on a dark, lonely road, half expecting to see it again. I've never been much of a believer in the supernatural or unexplained. I'm just a regular guy who works hard and tries to live a normal life. But that experience shook me to my core and forced me to confront the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something more otherworldly. All I know is what I saw that night, and it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the wilderness around Grand Prairie. Part of me hopes I never see it again, but another part of me is curious. What if we could prove its existence? What if we could solve this mystery once and for all? But then I remember the primal fear I felt that night, the way my blood ran cold and every instinct screamed at me to run. And I think maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've never shared this story publicly before. I guess I was afraid of the ridicule or of people thinking I was crazy. But I know what I saw. Stuart knows what he saw. And maybe by sharing this, someone else who's had a similar experience will feel less alone. So that's my story. Take from it what you will. But I'll tell you this, I'll never look at the woods the same way again. And whenever I hear stories of Bigfoot sightings or other unexplained encounters, I don't laugh them off anymore. Because I know that sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. Story 7. I was just a teenager back in '85, but that summer camping trip in Jasper changed my life forever. My buddy Jack and I had been best friends since elementary school, always getting into mischief together. That year, we convinced our parents to let us go on a week-long backpacking trip in Jasper National Park, just the two of us. We thought we were so grown up and independent at 16 years old. The first few days were amazing, hiking through pristine wilderness, setting up camp each night under the stars. We felt like real adventurers. On the fourth day, we decided to tackle one of the more challenging trails that went up the side of a mountain. It was a tough climb, but the views at the top were breathtaking. We could see for miles in every direction, endless forests, jagged peaks, and glacial lakes. We were taking a break at the summit, catching our breath and chugging water, when movement in the distance caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a shadow, or my eyes playing tricks. But as I focused, I realized there was definitely something moving down the mountainside across the valley from us. "Hey, Jack, check that out," I said, pointing. "Is that a mountain biker?" Jack squinted in the direction I was pointing. "Where?" "Oh, wait, I see it now. Yeah, must be a biker. Crazy to ride down terrain that steep, though." We watched for a few moments, transfixed. The figure was moving incredibly fast, bounding down the rocky slope. As it got closer, a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. "Dude, that's not a biker," I said slowly. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. And it wasn't riding anything. It was running on 2 legs, leaping from rock to rock with unnatural agility. Its body was covered in dark brown fur. "What the hell is that thing?" Jack whispered, his voice shaking. I couldn't answer. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't match anything I knew existed in these mountains. A bear? No, it was clearly bipedal. A person in a costume? Impossible. No human could move like that on such dangerous terrain. We watched in stunned silence as the creature continued its rapid descent. It covered an immense distance in what seemed like seconds, bounding over car-sized boulders and navigating sheer cliff faces as if they were nothing. The way it moved was mesmerizing and terrifying, powerful, fluid, and completely inhuman. About halfway down the mountain, it passed through a stand of young trees. I'll never forget the sight of this enormous fur-covered being, dwarfing those trees as it effortlessly pushed through them. The tops of the trees barely reached its shoulders. Jack and I exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief. Neither of us could find words to express what we were witnessing. In less than 2 minutes, the creature had traversed the entire mountainside. Just before it reached the tree line at the base, it paused for a moment. Even from this distance, I swear I could feel it looking in our direction. A primal fear gripped me, and I had to fight the urge to run and hide. Then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished into the thick forest below. We sat there in shocked silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Jack spoke up. "Tell me you saw that too. Tell me I'm not going crazy." I nodded slowly. "I saw it. What do you think it was?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know, man, but it sure as hell wasn't human." We debated for a while about what to do. Should we tell someone? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to cut our trip short and head back to civilization. Neither of us felt comfortable staying out in those woods any longer. The hike back down was tense. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made us jump. We kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see that creature watching us. When we finally made it back to the ranger station, we were exhausted and on edge. We went back and forth on whether to report what we'd seen. Part of me was desperate to tell someone, to validate that this insane experience had really happened. But another part of me was afraid of being laughed at or dismissed as just some dumb kids making up stories. In the end, we kept it to ourselves. Who would believe 2 teenage boys claiming they saw some kind of giant, fur-covered humanoid racing down a mountain? We'd be laughed out of town. But I've never forgotten that day. The image of that creature is burned into my memory. Sometimes I still have nightmares about it. Dreams where I'm being chased through the forest by something huge and fast and not quite human. Over the years, I've done a lot of research trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other strange creatures. Some of the descriptions match what we witnessed, but I've never found a fully satisfying explanation. Jack and I drifted apart after high school, but we still talk occasionally. When we do, the conversation inevitably turns to that day in Jasper. We'll reminisce about the trip, dancing around the subject at first, but eventually one of us will bring it up. Do you ever think about, what we saw that day? And we'll spend hours going over every detail, trying to rationalize it, wondering if we really saw what we think we saw. But deep down, we both know the truth. Something impossible happened on that mountain. Something that defies explanation. I've never been back to Jasper. Part of me wants to return, to see if I can find any evidence or clues. But an even bigger part of me is terrified of what I might find. What if it's still out there? Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I'll get a prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And for a split second, I'll imagine I see a dark shape moving through the trees. My heart races, and I'm right back on that mountain, frozen in fear and awe. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what Jack and I saw that day. But I do know that it changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the wilderness, just out of sight. So if you're ever hiking in Jasper, keep your eyes on the mountainsides. And if you see something moving too fast, too fluidly for a normal animal, well, just be careful out there. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows. Story 8. I still remember that day in October 1985 like it was yesterday. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the Poconos in vibrant reds and golds. My 12-year-old son and I had decided to take a weekend camping trip with my buddy Leo up in the mountains. We were cruising along Route 940, windows down, taking in that crisp fall air. It was late afternoon and the sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the road. We'd been driving for a couple hours and were looking forward to setting up camp before dark. My son was in the back seat, nose buried in a comic book. Leo and I were up front, chatting about work and whatnot. I remember glancing at the clock. It was about 5:30 p.m. That's when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, off to the right side of the road. At first I thought it was just a tree trunk or something, but then it moved. "Hey, check that out," I said to Leo, nodding towards the tree line. He leaned forward, peering out the passenger window. "What am I looking at?" "There's some kind of animal over there," I replied, slowing the car a bit. As we got closer, I could make out more details. It was big, way bigger than a person, probably 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall. But the thing that really struck me was the way it was moving. It was on 2 legs, but not like any animal I'd ever seen before. "Is that a bear?" Leo asked, squinting into the fading daylight. I shook my head slowly. "I don't think so, man. Look at how it's walking." The creature's gait was off somehow. Not quite human, but not like any 4-legged animal either. It was taking these long, loping strides, swinging its arms in an exaggerated way. The movements were fluid, but unnatural at the same time. My son had looked up from his comic book by this point. "Dad, what is that?" he asked, voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and unease. "I'm not sure, buddy," I replied, trying to keep my own voice steady. I didn't want to freak him out, but my heart was starting to race. As we drew closer, I could see that the creature was covered in thick, shaggy fur. It was a reddish-brown color, like cinnamon or rust. In the fading light, the fur seemed to shimmer slightly as the creature moved. I'd slowed the car to a crawl by this point, all of us transfixed by the sight before us. We were maybe 50 yards away when the creature suddenly stopped and turned its head towards us. I felt my blood run cold. Its face was wrong. Not quite human, not quite animal. The features were oddly proportioned, with a heavy brow and a broad, flat nose. But it was the eyes that really got me. They were dark and intelligent, and for a split second I swear they locked right onto mine. In that moment, I felt a wave of primal fear wash over me. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I was frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. The creature held our gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, in one fluid motion, it turned and loped into the dense pine forest bordering the road. For a few moments, none of us spoke. The only sound was the idle of the engine and our own ragged breathing. What the hell was that?" Leo finally managed to stammer out. I shook my head, trying to collect my thoughts. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I've never seen anything like it before." My son piped up from the back seat, his voice small and shaky. "Dad, was that Bigfoot?" I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was just a bear or some other normal animal, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. "I don't know, buddy," I said again, "but whatever it was, it's gone now. We're okay." We sat there for a few more minutes, all of us processing what we'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to get out and investigate, to see if there were any tracks or other signs of the creature. But a larger part, the part concerned with keeping my son safe, knew we needed to get out of there. I put the car in drive and slowly accelerated, my eyes darting between the road and the tree line. The rest of the drive to our campsite was tense and quiet. We kept expecting the creature to burst out of the woods at any moment. When we finally arrived at the campground, it was almost fully dark. We debated whether to stay or head back home, but ultimately decided to set up camp. Safety in numbers, we figured, and there were other campers around. That night, huddled around the campfire, we talked through what we'd seen. Leo was convinced it had been a bear, albeit a strange one. My son was certain it was Bigfoot. I didn't know what to think. We spent the rest of the weekend looking over our shoulders, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling bush. But we never saw the creature again. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what we saw that day. Maybe it was just a bear walking funny. Maybe the fading light played tricks on our eyes. But deep down, I know what I saw. It wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered before or since. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings in the area over the years. Some of the descriptions match what we saw pretty closely. But I've never shared our story publicly before now. Partly out of fear of ridicule, I suppose, and partly because a small part of me is still scared of that creature, even after all these years. I don't know if it was Bigfoot, or some other unknown animal, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw that day on Route 940 was real, and the memory of those intelligent, almost human eyes still haunts me to this day. Sometimes when I'm driving through wooded areas, I find myself scanning the tree line. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse, to prove to myself I'm not crazy. But another part dreads the thought of ever encountering that creature again. I've never been much for the supernatural or conspiracy theories. I'm just a regular guy who had an experience I can't explain. But that day in October 1985 shook my worldview to its core. It made me realize that there are things out there we don't understand, things that defy conventional explanation. My son is grown now with kids of his own. We don't talk about that day much anymore, but sometimes, when we're together in the woods, I catch him glancing nervously at the trees. I know he's remembering too. Leo and I are still friends, though we've drifted apart some over the years. Whenever we get together, there's always a moment where we exchange a look, silently acknowledging our shared experience. We don't need to say anything, we both know. I'm not sure why I'm sharing this story now, after all these years. Maybe it's because I'm getting older, and I want to get it off my chest. Maybe it's because with all the trail cameras and smartphones these days, I keep hoping someone will capture proof of what we saw. Or maybe it's because deep down, I still hope for an explanation. Some way to make sense of what happened that autumn day on Route 940. But I've come to accept that I may never get answers. Some mysteries, it seems, are destined to remain unsolved. All I know for certain is what I saw that day. A creature that shouldn't exist, but does. A glimpse into a world beyond our understanding. And the lingering fear that somewhere out there, in the dense forests of the Poconos, that creature is still roaming free. Story 9. I was just a teenager back in November 1995, eager to join my dad on our annual hunting trip near Longview. We'd been going there for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that day. It still sends chills down my spine thinking about it, even after all this time. The day started like any other hunting trip. We woke up before dawn, had a quick breakfast, and headed out into the crisp autumn air. There was a light fog hanging over the fields as we made our way to our usual spot. Dad always said it was prime deer country. We set up in our blind and settled in for a long day of waiting. Hours passed with nothing but the occasional bird or squirrel. I was starting to get antsy, shifting around trying to stay comfortable on the hard wooden bench. Dad kept shushing me, saying I'd scare away any deer that might wander by. It was late afternoon when I first spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. I nudged my dad and pointed. About 100 yards out across the field, I saw what I thought was a person dressed all in black. My first thought was, it must be another hunter, even though I knew we were on private land. But something seemed off about the way it was moving. It was unnaturally fluid, almost gliding across the ground. And fast, so incredibly fast. Before I could even process what I was seeing, it had covered half the distance of the field in just a few seconds. "Dad, do you see that?" I whispered urgently. He was squinting, trying to focus on where I was pointing. "I don't see anything, son." "Where exactly?" He didn't get to finish his sentence. Suddenly, the figure was at the edge of the tree line on the far side of the field, easily 150 yards from where I'd first spotted it. It had covered that distance in the blink of an eye. My breath caught in my throat. This was no human. No person could move like that. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as an icy chill ran through me. "There!" I hissed, grabbing my dad's arm. "By the trees!" He finally saw it then. I heard his sharp intake of breath. "What in God's name is that?" he muttered. The creature was just standing there now, perfectly still. It was hard to make out details at that distance, but it seemed to be around 7 feet tall, covered head to toe in pitch black. Fur? Hair? I couldn't tell. Its proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, torso too broad. We sat there frozen, hardly daring to breathe. I don't know how long we stared at it. Time seemed to stand still. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but a larger part was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away. Suddenly, its head snapped in our direction. I swear I could feel its gaze boring into me, even though I couldn't make out any eyes. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then, in a burst of movement almost too fast to follow, it was gone, just vanished into the trees. We sat there in stunned silence for several long moments. Finally, my dad cleared his throat. I think we should head back now." His voice sounded shaky, uncertain. I just nodded mutely. We gathered our gear with trembling hands and practically ran back to the truck. The whole way I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see that thing bounding after us. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that defied explanation. I could tell my dad was struggling to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation. But we both knew the truth. We'd encountered something not of this world. That night I lay awake for hours, unable to get the image of that creature out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there at the edge of the woods, unnaturally still. And then that moment when it looked right at us, I shuddered, pulling the blankets tighter around me. Over the following days and weeks, I became obsessed with trying to figure out what we'd seen. I scoured the internet for similar encounters, pored over books on cryptozoology. Dad discouraged it, said I should just try to forget about the whole thing. But how could I? It had shaken my entire worldview. The closest match I could find was accounts of Bigfoot sightings, but this thing didn't really fit the typical Sasquatch description. It was too tall, too thin, and that incredible speed and agility. It was like nothing I'd ever heard of before. As time passed, the memory faded somewhat, but I never forgot. How could I? It was burned into my mind forever. I never went hunting again after that day. Just couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, that creature's featureless face hovering in the darkness of my bedroom. I've never told anyone else about what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I still live in the area, and every now and then I hear whispered stories. Hunters who've had strange encounters in the woods, hikers who've felt watched by unseen eyes. Makes me wonder if that thing is still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back, to try and find some proof. But then I remember the primal terror I felt that day, the way my entire body screamed danger in its presence, and I know I never want to experience that again. So I stay away from the woods now. I tell myself it's because I'm older, don't enjoy the outdoors like I used to. But deep down, I know the real reason. I'm afraid of what I might find out there. Afraid I might come face to face with that creature again. And this time, I might not be lucky enough to just walk away. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something more otherworldly. But I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. So if you're ever out in the woods near Longview and you feel like something's watching you, trust that instinct, because you never know what might be hiding just out of sight, waiting, and you definitely don't want to find out. Story 10. I'll never forget that day in September 2000. It was supposed to be just another fun afternoon riding ATVs with my buddy John on my grandpa's property near Rycroft, Alberta. But what we encountered out there in those woods still haunts me to this day. I was 13 at the time, and John was 15. We'd been best friends for years and spent countless weekends exploring my grandpa's sprawling acreage on our four-wheelers. That Saturday started out normal enough. The late summer air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to change color. John and I packed some snacks and drinks and headed out after lunch, excited to spend the afternoon cruising the trails. For the first couple hours, everything was great. We raced each other down the paths, kicked up mud puddles, and just goofed around like usual. But then, as we were taking a break near an old fallen tree, we heard it. This bizarre animal cry echoing through the woods. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite a howl or a roar, but this guttural, almost human-sounding scream that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. John and I looked at each other with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I shook my head, trying to play it cool even though my heart was racing. "Probably just a bear or something," I said with forced casualness. But we both knew it didn't sound like any bear. Against my better judgment, we decided to investigate. We slowly rode our ATVs in the direction the sound had come from. As we went deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser and less sunlight filtered through. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. After about 10 minutes, we came across some weird tracks in a muddy section of the trail. They were huge, easily 15 inches long, way bigger than any bear prints I'd ever seen. And they looked almost human-like, but distorted and massive. John and I just stared at them in shock for a minute. "Dude, what do you think made these?" John whispered. I shook my head, at a loss for words. Part of me wanted to turn back right then and there. But morbid curiosity pushed us onward. We continued following the tracks for another quarter-mile or so, until we heard the gurgling of a nearby creek. As we approached the water, that's when we saw it. About 50 yards away, near the edge of the creek, was this massive, fur-covered creature. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in shaggy brown-black hair, and it was standing upright on 2 legs like a person. I felt the blood drain from my face as I took in the impossible sight before me. This thing, whatever it wasn't human, but it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen either. John and I were frozen in place, too terrified to move. We watched as the creature bent down and seemed to be drinking from the creek. Then suddenly its head snapped up and it looked directly at us. I'll never forget those eyes for as long as I live. They were dark and intelligent, almost human-like. But there was something wild and ancient in that gaze that chilled me to my core. The creature's face was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had a heavy brow ridge and a broad, flat nose. The skin was dark and leathery-looking. But the thing that struck me most was how it looked almost ape-like, like some impossible hybrid of human and gorilla. For what felt like an eternity, we all just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind reeling as it tried to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. And yet there it was, less than 200 feet away, regarding us with an unsettling intelligence. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The creature turned and moved with shocking speed into the thick brush, disappearing from view almost instantly. The whole encounter probably only lasted 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. As soon as it vanished, the spell was broken. John and I looked at each other in wide-eyed disbelief before scrambling back onto our ATVs. We tore out of there as fast as we could, not saying a word until we were safely back at my grandpa's house. Once we caught our breath, we tried to process what we'd just witnessed. That was real, right? John asked shakily. You saw it too? I nodded, still struggling to form words. We debated whether or not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. But we knew what we saw. That thing was real, as impossible as it seemed. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. We were worried people would think we were lying or just being dumb kids making up stories. But that encounter changed something in both of us. We never went back to that part of the property again. It's been over 20 years now, but I still think about that day all the time. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings since then, and so many details match up with what John and I saw. That distinctive smell people describe, like wet dog and rotting vegetation. I remember that smell vividly, though I didn't consciously register it in the moment. The way the creature moved with surprising grace and agility despite its size. The intelligence in its eyes. I've never been able to fully explain or understand what we encountered that day. Was it really Bigfoot? Some unknown species? I don't know. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't human or any known animal. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming those woods. Part of me wants to go back someday, to try to find proof, but an even bigger part of me is still terrified by the memory. There are things in this world that defy explanation, and coming face to face with one of them shook me to my core. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I can barely believe it myself. But I know what John and I experienced was real. That creature was real. And the fear I felt in that moment, the bone-deep, primal terror of encountering something that should not exist, that was more real than anything I've ever known. So I guess I'm sharing this as a warning. Be careful out there in the wilderness. You never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. There are things in this world that we don't understand, things that don't fit neatly into our view of reality. I learned that lesson the hard way on that September afternoon so long ago, and it's a lesson I'll never forget. Story 11. I'll never forget that weekend camping trip back in May of 1988. My boyfriend Tom and I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to get away from the city and enjoy some time in nature at Waterton Lakes National Park. We packed up the car on Friday afternoon and hit the road, excited for a relaxing couple of days of hiking and camping. The drive was beautiful, as we wound our way through the mountains. As the sun started to set, we found ourselves on Cameron Falls Drive, getting close to our campground. We were chatting and laughing, windows down to enjoy the crisp mountain air. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, this massive dark figure suddenly appeared on the road ahead of us. Tom slammed on the brakes, and we both leaned forward, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. At first glance, I thought it was a bear standing up on its hind legs, but as my eyes focused, I realized this was something else entirely. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark, shaggy fur. But the way it moved, it wasn't lumbering like a bear. This thing took 3 huge strides and crossed the entire width of the road in seconds. Its gait was smooth and purposeful, and its arms, they were so long, swinging at its sides as it walked. I caught a glimpse of its face as it turned slightly towards our headlights. My blood ran cold. The face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected red in the light. But there was an intelligence there that terrified me to my core. This was no animal, at least not one that was supposed to exist. In a matter of moments, it had disappeared into the thick forest on the other side of the road. Tom and I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Finally, he turned to me with wide eyes and said, "Did you see that?" I could only nod, my hands shaking as I clutched the door handle. I wanted nothing more than to turn the car around and get the hell out of there. But we were miles from the nearest town, and it was getting dark fast. Tom tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a bear, and our eyes were playing tricks on us in the fading light. But I knew what I saw. That was no bear. We drove the rest of the way to the campground in tense silence. I kept my eyes glued to the trees lining the road, terrified that massive figure would come bursting out at any moment. By the time we pulled into our campsite, my nerves were completely frayed. Setting up the tent was a rushed, clumsy affair. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely manage the tent poles. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf in the surrounding forest made me jump. Tom kept trying to calm me down, but I could tell he was unsettled too. He suggested we skip the campfire and just hunker down in the tent for the night. I was more than happy to agree. Sleep did not come easy that night. Every sound from the forest sent my imagination into overdrive. Was that just the wind, or heavy footsteps circling our tent? That low grumble, a far-off bear or something much closer? I lay there rigid in my sleeping bag, straining my ears and expecting at any moment to hear the zipper of our tent being slowly opened by massive, hairy hands. Somehow, I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent walls. The sounds of other campers moving about and birds chirping helped ease some of the paralyzing fear from the night before. But I still felt on edge. Tom suggested we go for a hike to clear our heads and enjoy the beautiful day. I reluctantly agreed, though the thought of venturing into those woods made my stomach churn. We packed some snacks and water and set off on one of the park's more popular trails, figuring there would be safety in numbers with other hikers around. For the first hour or so, the hike actually started to calm my nerves a bit. The sunshine, fresh air, and breathtaking mountain views were a welcome distraction. We passed several other groups of hikers, exchanging friendly nods. I started to think maybe I had overreacted the night before. Maybe it really had just been a bear, and my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then we rounded a bend in the trail, and I stopped dead in my tracks. There in the soft dirt were a set of footprints that made my blood run cold. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's boot, and the shape, they weren't quite human, but definitely bipedal. 5 toes clearly visible, with sharp claw marks at the tips. Tom saw them too and tried to brush it off, saying they were probably just from a really big hiker. but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe that any more than I did. We hurried back down the trail, my eyes constantly scanning the trees around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night was even worse than the first. Every sound had me on high alert. I kept imagining that creature's glowing eyes peering at us through the darkness. Sleep was impossible. I just lay there, my whole body tense, waiting for something terrible to happen. When the first light of dawn finally came, I told Tom I couldn't take it anymore. We needed to leave. Now. He didn't argue. We packed up our campsite in record time and were on the road before most of the other campers had even emerged from their tents. As we drove away from Waterton Lakes, I felt an immense sense of relief wash over me. But I also knew I would never be able to forget what I saw on that road. That massive, ape-like figure striding across on two legs, those intense, intelligent eyes. I've tried to convince myself over the years that it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I know the truth. Something inhuman lives in those mountains, something that's not supposed to exist. I've never been camping since that weekend, and to this day, I can't drive down a wooded road at night without my heart racing, half expecting to see that hulking silhouette appear in my headlights once again. I don't know what it was we encountered that night. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species of primate. I have no idea. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. That weekend changed how I view the world and the mysteries it holds. There are things out there beyond our understanding, and sometimes ignorance really is bliss. Story 12. It was late December 2004, just a few days after Christmas. I had decided to take a solo drive through Waterton Lakes National Park to clear my head and enjoy some winter scenery. The weather was gloomy and overcast, with a thick blanket of clouds hanging low in the sky. As I cruised along the winding Akamina Parkway, my mind wandered, lost in thought. The road was completely empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. It was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of my engine and the crunch of tires on the snowy pavement breaking the silence. Bare trees lined the roadside, their skeletal branches reaching up into the grey sky. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard. It was just past 3 p.m., but the heavy cloud cover made it feel much later. The weak winter light was already starting to fade, casting long shadows across the landscape. As I rounded a bend in the road, something caught my eye off to the right. At first, I thought it was just another tree or a large rock formation, but as I drew closer, I realized with a jolt that it was moving. My foot instinctively eased off the gas pedal as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There, not 50 feet from the road, was an enormous black figure. It was partially obscured by the trees, but I could clearly see that it was alive and massive. My heart began to race as my brain scrambled to process the sight. The figure had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was covered in dark, shaggy fur that rippled slightly in the cold breeze. For a split second, I wondered if it could be a bear. But no, the proportions were all wrong. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs, with long arms that hung down past its knees. As I stared in disbelief, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There was a full-grown bull elk standing nearby, and this creature absolutely dwarfed it. The elk seemed frozen in place, as if it too was transfixed by the massive being. I must have let out an audible gasp, because at that moment the creature's head snapped in my direction. I caught a glimpse of a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. With deliberate slowness, the being raised its left arm and pushed aside a large tree branch that was partially obscuring its body. The casual display of strength made my skin crawl. It moved the heavy limb as easily as I might brush aside a cobweb. As the branch moved, I got my first full view of the creature's immense bulk. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering down to a narrow waist. Powerful muscles rippled beneath its dark fur as it shifted its weight. My hands were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles had gone white. I wanted desperately to floor the gas pedal and speed away, but I was paralyzed. It felt like hours, but in reality only a few seconds had passed since I first spotted the creature. Suddenly, without warning, it moved. In a blur of dark fur, the being turned and bounded into the thick forest. Its long strides ate up the ground with terrifying speed. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished into the trees, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. The elk, startled by the sudden movement, let out a bellow and bolted in the opposite direction. The sound snapped me out of my trance, and I realized I had been holding my breath. My foot finally found the gas pedal, and I sped forward, my tires squealing slightly on the snowy road. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, and I found myself continually glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the tree line to give chase. But there was nothing behind me except empty road stretching into the distance. I drove in a state of panic for several miles before I felt safe enough to slow down and try to collect my thoughts. What the hell had I just seen? My mind raced through possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. A bear? No, definitely not. Some kind of escaped zoo animal. But what zoo would have a creature like that? As my breathing slowly returned to normal, one word kept floating to the surface of my scattered thoughts. Bigfoot. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? Bigfoot was a myth, a legend, not something you actually encountered on a random drive through a national park. And yet, what else could explain what I had seen? The massive size, the fur, the eerily human-like qualities, it all fit the descriptions I'd heard of Bigfoot sightings. I spent the rest of the drive in a daze, barely registering the scenery around me. When I finally arrived home, I sat in my driveway for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to call the park rangers or the police and report what I'd seen. But I knew how crazy it would sound. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I had seen it with my own eyes. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail. The next morning, I seriously considered driving back out to that spot on the Akamina Parkway. Maybe I would find tracks or broken branches, some kind of physical evidence to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But in the end, I couldn't bring myself to go back. The memory of that primal fear I had felt was still too fresh, too raw. What if the creature was still out there? What if this time it didn't just watch me pass by? In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the local news for any reports of strange sightings in Waterton Lakes. But there was nothing. Life in the area continued on as normal, with no one else seeming to have encountered anything out of the ordinary. I thought about confiding in friends or family, but I always stopped short. How could I explain what I had seen without sounding completely insane? So I kept it to myself, letting the experience gnaw at me silently. As time passed, I began to doubt my own memory. Had it really happened the way I remembered? Maybe it was just a bear, and my mind had blown it out of proportion. Maybe the stress and solitude of that winter drive had caused me to hallucinate. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The image of that massive fur-covered being was burned into my brain. The intelligent gleam in its eyes as it watched me, the casual strength it displayed in moving that tree branch, the incredible speed with which it disappeared into the forest. No, it wasn't a bear or any other known animal, and it certainly wasn't a hallucination. Whatever I encountered that day on the Akamina Parkway was real, and it was something science can't explain. I've spent years trying to rationalize that experience, to fit it into my understanding of the world, but I can't. All I know is that for a brief moment on a cold December afternoon, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and it changed me forever. I still love the outdoors, and I still visit national parks when I can, but I've never been back to Waterton Lakes. And I always feel a twinge of unease when I'm in a remote forested area. Part of me is always on alert, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, because now I know that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without seeing. And while part of me wishes I could forget that day in 2004, another part of me is oddly grateful. That encounter opened my eyes to the fact that the world is a much stranger and more mysterious place than we realize. There are still unknowns out there, still discoveries to be made. And while that can be terrifying, it's also oddly comforting. So I keep this story to myself, a secret knowledge that both thrills and haunts me. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself wondering about that creature. Is it still out there, roaming the forests of Waterton Lakes? Has anyone else glimpsed it over the years? And will there ever come a day when the existence of such beings is finally, irrefutably proven? I don't know the answers to these questions, but I do know that I'll never forget that cold December day when, for a few heart-stopping moments, I came face to face with the impossible. Story 13. We'd driven up to Cypress Hills on Friday afternoon and set up our little campsite near the lake. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze coming off the water. We spent that first evening just sitting by the campfire, talking and looking at the stars. Everything felt so peaceful. Saturday morning we got up early, eager to get out on the lake and do some fishing. We packed up our gear and hiked down to the shore. The lake was like glass, reflecting the trees and sky above. We pushed our little aluminum boat out into the water and started paddling to our favorite fishing spot. For the first few hours, everything was going great. We'd caught a few decent-sized trout and were just enjoying being out in nature together. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have these quiet moments away from the stress of work and daily life. It must have been around 11 a.m. when things started to feel off. The birds that had been chirping all morning suddenly went silent. The air felt heavy, almost electric. I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed my girlfriend had stopped fishing and was staring intently at something on the shore. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. There, walking along a trail about 50 yards from the water's edge, was the biggest, strangest creature I've ever seen. It was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy reddish-brown fur. At first glance I thought it might be a bear, but the way it moved was all wrong. It walked upright on 2 legs, taking these huge, graceful strides. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. There was no way this thing actually existed. But there it was, clear as day. The creature seemed oblivious to our presence at first. It just kept walking along the trail, covering an incredible amount of ground with each step. I've never seen anything move like that. It was oddly fluid and purposeful. I don't know how long we sat there staring, maybe 30 seconds or so. Then suddenly, as if sensing our eyes on it, the thing stopped walking and slowly turned its head in our direction. I swear my heart stopped for a moment when I saw its face. It was disturbingly human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through me. There was an intelligence there that sent chills down my spine. For a few breathless seconds, we just looked at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. Then the creature did something that still baffles me to this day. It started pulling up handfuls of grass and plants from the ground, almost like it was trying to look busy or distract itself. I remember thinking how bizarrely human that behavior seemed, like a person pretending to be occupied when they realize someone's watching them. It was such a strangely self-conscious thing for this massive, inhuman creature to do. My girlfriend must have made some small sound then, because the thing's head snapped up and it fixed those unnerving eyes on us again. I saw its nostrils flare like it was sniffing the air. A low, rumbling growl started deep in its chest. That's when the panic really set in. I knew we had to get out of there fast. With shaking hands, I grabbed the oars and started rowing for shore as quickly as I could. My girlfriend was crying softly, keeping her eyes locked on the creature the whole time. We were only about halfway back when a thick, unnatural fog started rolling in across the lake. Within seconds, visibility dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see a few feet in front of the boat. The fog seemed to muffle all sound, too. The lapping of the water against the boat, the splash of the oars, even our own panicked breathing. It all sounded distant and muted. It was like being wrapped in a suffocating blanket of white. I had no idea which direction the shore was anymore. We could have been rowing in circles for all I knew. I was terrified we'd end up back near that thing. Every shadow in the mist looked like a hulking figure ready to reach out and grab us. I don't know how long we drifted in that eerie fog. It felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the mist began to dissipate. As our surroundings came back into view, I realized with relief that we'd somehow made it close to our original campsite. I've never been so glad to see solid ground in my life. We practically threw ourselves out of the boat and scrambled up the bank. Once on shore, we turned to look back at where we'd seen the creature. There was no sign of it anywhere. The woods were quiet and still, looking perfectly ordinary in the midday sun. If it wasn't for the lingering sense of dread in my gut, I could almost believe I'd imagined the whole thing. We didn't say much as we packed up camp. We were both still in shock, I think. Neither of us wanted to spend another night out there, so we loaded everything into the car and hightailed it back to civilization. It took days before we could really talk about what happened. Even now, 30 years later, I get chills thinking about it. I've gone over it in my mind 1,000 times, trying to rationalize what we saw. But I know deep down that it was real. That day at Spruce Coulee Lake, we encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that shook my understanding of the world to its core. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or some other undiscovered creature. All I know is that it was terrifyingly real, and I hope to God I never see anything like it again. I still fish sometimes, but never at that lake. And I always keep one eye on the tree line now, half expecting to see a massive fur-covered shape emerge from the shadows. Some experiences change you forever, and that day on the lake was definitely one of them for me. I've never told many people this story. Who would believe it? But sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear that low, inhuman growl echoing in the distance, and I know that somewhere out there that creature is still roaming the wilderness, waiting to be seen again. Story 14. The first couple days were exactly what I needed, just me, Max, and the great outdoors. We'd spend our days hiking the trails and our nights sitting by the campfire, looking up at more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. It was peaceful, you know, just what the doctor ordered. On the third day, I decided to explore a bit further out from our campsite. There was supposed to be a really nice river about an hour's hike away, so Max and I set out early that morning to check it out. The trail was pretty overgrown, but it was a beautiful day, and I was enjoying the challenge. We finally made it to the river around mid-morning. Man, it was gorgeous. Crystal clear water rushing over smooth stones, tall pines on either bank. I found a nice spot on the shore to sit and eat my trail mix while Max splashed around in the shallows. After a while, I decided to follow the river a bit to see if I could find a good fishing spot for later. Max trotted along beside me, nose to the ground, tail wagging. We'd gone maybe half a mile when suddenly Max froze. His ears perked up, and he let out this low growl I'd never heard from him before. I looked around, trying to figure out what had spooked him. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I noticed what looked like a huge boulder about 130 yards upriver. I remember thinking it was weird I hadn't noticed it before. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. I was squinting, trying to get a better look, when the boulder moved. I'm not exaggerating when I say my blood ran cold. It slowly rose up on 2 legs, and I realized with dawning horror that I was looking at some kind of enormous creature. It took 3 slow, deliberate steps towards the tree line. Even from that distance, I could tell each stride covered at least 6 feet. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd ever seen, powerful, but eerily graceful at the same time. Just before it reached the trees, it turned its head and looked directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes, dark and intelligent, almost human-like. For a split second, our gazes locked, and I felt this overwhelming sense of, I don't know, recognition, understanding. It's hard to explain. Then, in the blink of an eye, it melted into the shadows of the forest. 1 second it was there, this massive presence, and the next it had vanished completely. If I hadn't been staring right at it, I never would have believed something that big could disappear so quickly and silently. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my ears. Max was whining and pulling at his leash, clearly wanting to get the hell out of there. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I turned and ran back the way we'd come, not stopping until we reached the campsite. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the tent unzipped. I threw our stuff inside haphazardly and was in my car peeling out of there within 10 minutes. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and signs of civilization. It's been almost a year, and I still can't make sense of what I saw that day. I've done a ton of research since then, read countless stories from other people who've had similar encounters. Some say it was Bigfoot. Others think it's some undiscovered species. All I know is that it was real, and it fundamentally changed how I view the world and our place in it. I haven't been camping since that trip. Just the thought of being out in those woods again makes my palms sweat. Max still gets anxious whenever we're around dense forest. I think he remembers too. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something large moving in the trees while I'm driving, or I'll wake up in a cold sweat from dreams of those eyes staring into mine, and I know it really happened. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that moment when I realized just how little we truly know about the world around us. I've debated sharing this story for months. Part of me is afraid people will think I'm crazy or attention-seeking, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest to tell someone who might understand or have experienced something similar. The encounter itself only lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it's stayed with me every day since. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder when I'm outdoors, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. I've become hyper-aware of how vulnerable we really are out in nature. One of the things that haunts me most is wondering if it was a shock to see me as I was to see it. The look in its eyes seemed almost curious, like it was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. Sometimes I wonder if it's out there right now, thinking about our brief encounter and trying to make sense of it too. I've tried to rationalize it in 100 different ways. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the summer heat and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't any known animal. The way it moved, the intelligence in its gaze, it was something else entirely. I've become a bit obsessed with trying to find answers. I've joined online forums, read every book I can find on cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. I've even considered going back to that spot with a camera, but the thought of actually seeing it again terrifies me. The worst part is not having anyone to really talk to about it. My friends and family humor me, but I can tell they think I'm exaggerating or misremembering. How do you explain something like that to someone who wasn't there? How do you put into words the bone-deep certainty that you've seen something that shouldn't exist? I find myself analyzing every detail of that day, trying to remember any clue I might have missed. Was there any sound before Max alerted? Did I see any tracks or signs that something large had passed through recently? My mind keeps circling back, desperate for some concrete evidence that what I experienced was real. Sometimes I'll be going about my day normally when suddenly the memory hits me like a punch to the gut. I'll be in the middle of a meeting at work or grocery shopping, and suddenly I'm right back there on that riverbank, heart racing as I lock eyes with something impossible. I've started seeing a therapist to try to process everything. She's been helpful in dealing with the anxiety and hypervigilance, but I can tell she doesn't really believe my story. I don't blame her. If someone had told me this a year ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, try to keep an open mind. There are things out there that defy explanation, things that challenge everything we think we know about the world. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that day. But I do know that it's changed me forever. I look at the world differently now, with a mix of wonder and wariness. And every time I'm near the woods, I can't help but wonder, is it out there watching me right now? Story 15. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 40 years now. I was 10 years old, playing in our backyard with my little sister as the sun started to set. We lived on the outskirts of town in Washington County, Ohio, with woods bordering our property. It was a warm evening in late summer of 1978, and we were trying to squeeze in a few more minutes of fun before Mom called us in for dinner. I was pushing my sister on the tire swing that hung from the big oak tree near the edge of our yard. We were laughing and joking around, not really paying attention to our surroundings, but then something caught my eye. Movement at the tree line about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just shadows from the fading light playing tricks on me, but as I looked closer, I realized there was definitely something there. My heart started racing as I focused on the dark shape partially obscured by the trees. It was huge, way bigger than any person I'd ever seen, and the way it was moving was just wrong. It was hunched over, almost gorilla-like, pushing aside small trees and branches as it slowly made its way along the edge of the woods. I froze, my hand still on the tire swing. "Do you see that?" I whispered to my sister. She stopped giggling and looked where I was pointing. Her eyes went wide, and she let out a little gasp. That's when it stopped moving. The creature slowly turned its head and looked directly at us. Even from that distance, I could feel its gaze lock onto mine. A chill ran through my entire body. I felt rooted to the spot, like I couldn't move even if I wanted to. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I still don't know how long it actually lasted, probably only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I could hear my sister's panicked breathing next to me. The rest of the world seemed to fade away until it was just us and that thing. Finally, some primal instinct kicked in, and I grabbed my sister's arm. "Run!" I yelled, yanking her off the swing. We sprinted toward the house as fast as our legs could carry us. I didn't dare look back to see if it was following. We burst through the back door, slamming it behind us. Mom was in the kitchen getting dinner ready, and Dad was reading the paper in his armchair. They both looked up, startled by our noisy entrance. "What in the world?" Mom exclaimed. We were both talking a mile a minute, tripping over our words as we tried to explain what we'd seen. I'm sure we sounded hysterical. Dad got up and came over to us, telling us to slow down and catch our breath. Once we calmed down enough to speak coherently, I described the creature, how big it was, the way it moved, those piercing eyes. My sister chimed in too, confirming everything I was saying. I kept expecting our parents to dismiss it as overactive imaginations or tell us we must have seen a bear. But to my surprise, they listened intently and seemed to take us seriously. Dad went to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness, though I knew he wouldn't be able to see anything from there. He turned back to us with a thoughtful look on his face. "I believe you saw something out there," he said slowly. "I can't explain what it was, but I know you two wouldn't make this up." Mom pulled us into a hug. I could feel her trembling slightly. "It's okay now. You're safe inside," she murmured. But I noticed her shooting worried glances toward the windows. We ate dinner in tense silence that night. Afterwards, Dad went outside with his rifle to look around, but of course there was no sign of the creature by then. He and Mom had a long, whispered conversation once they thought we were in bed. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was serious. For weeks after that, we weren't allowed to play outside alone, especially not near dusk. Dad started locking the doors at night, which he'd never done before. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out at the woods with a troubled expression. It was probably a month before things started to feel normal again. We never saw the creature again, but the memory of that encounter was seared into my mind. As I got older, I started to wonder if maybe I had imagined it or blown it out of proportion. But my sister and I would talk about it sometimes, and our recollections always matched up perfectly. It wasn't until years later that I learned about Bigfoot and started to connect the dots. The more I read about other sightings, the more convinced I became that's what we had seen that day. The size, the movement, the inhuman feeling of its gaze, it all fit. I know a lot of people are skeptical about Bigfoot, and I get it. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'm not sure I'd believe it either. But I know what I saw. That wasn't any normal animal, and it definitely wasn't human. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those eyes staring at me from the woods. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, that feeling of paralyzing fear washing over me all over again. My husband thinks I'm crazy, but he's kind enough not to say it out loud. I've never gone public with my story before. I guess I was afraid people would think I was nuts or attention-seeking. But lately I've been thinking about how important it is to share these experiences. Maybe if enough of us speak up, people will start to take it seriously. I don't know if that creature is still out there somewhere. Part of me hopes I'll see it again someday, just to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But another part of me is terrified of ever coming face to face with it again. That paralyzing gaze is something I'll never forget, as long as I live. So that's my story. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I swear on everything I hold dear that this is the absolute truth. That summer evening in 1978 changed my life forever. I know there are things in this world that science can't explain yet. I just hope that someday we'll have answers about what's really out there in the woods. Story 16. I was living on my family's farm in Stark County, Ohio at the time. We had a decent-sized property with a few acres of woods bordering the back fields. My husband Tom and I ran the place, mainly raising chickens and growing some crops. It was a quiet, simple life, at least until that summer evening when everything changed. It was a warm July night, probably around 10 p.m. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard some commotion coming from outside near the chicken coop. At first, I figured it was just a raccoon or something trying to get at the chickens again. But then I heard my nephew Scott yelling from out back. I quickly dried my hands and hurried out the back door to see what was going on. As I stepped onto the porch, I could see Scott's truck parked near the coop, its headlights illuminating the area. Scott was standing next to the driver's side door, peering intently at something in the darkness beyond the beams of light. "Aunt Evelyn," he called when he saw me, "you gotta come see this. There's something weird out here." I jogged over to where Scott was standing, my heart starting to race a bit. As I got closer, I could smell a really strong, acrid odor. It was like a mixture of ammonia and rotten eggs or something. I had to cover my nose. It was so overpowering. "What is it? What's going on?" I asked Scott as I reached the truck. He pointed out towards the edge of the woods. "I was driving by and I saw some kind of animals out there near the coop. I thought they might be coyotes or something, so I pulled over to check. But then I saw... I don't even know how to describe it." I squinted, trying to see what he was gesturing at. At first I didn't notice anything unusual in the dim light, but then I saw some movement in the shadows. My blood ran cold as two pairs of glowing eyes suddenly appeared, reflecting the truck's headlights. They were maybe 50 feet away, just at the tree line. The eyes were set fairly low to the ground, so I assumed they belonged to some kind of wild cats, maybe bobcats or mountain lions, but mountain lions weren't supposed to be in this part of Ohio. "Do you see them?" Scott whispered. I nodded, unable to take my eyes off the eerie glowing orbs staring back at us. We stood there frozen for what felt like several minutes, just watching those eyes watching us. I was about to suggest we go inside and call the game warden or something when the situation got even stranger. A loud snapping sound came from the woods, like a large branch breaking. The glowing eyes suddenly vanished as whatever creatures they belonged to darted away into the forest. But then we saw something else emerge from the trees. I'll never forget the sight as long as I live. This thing came lumbering out of the darkness. It was enormous, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, walking on 2 legs. But it wasn't human. The body was covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. The head was huge and oddly shaped, sitting directly on broad shoulders with hardly any neck visible. I let out an involuntary gasp, and Scott cursed under his breath. The creature's head snapped in our direction at the sounds. I found myself staring into 2 large yellowish eyes set deep in that monstrous face, a face that looked almost like a cross between an ape and a wolf. My legs felt like jelly. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The thing just stood there, swaying slightly as it looked at us. Then it took a lumbering step forward. "Get in the truck," Scott hissed urgently. He yanked open the driver's side door, and I scrambled around to the passenger side, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handle. We both climbed in, and Scott immediately locked the doors. I was trembling uncontrollably at this point. "What the hell is that thing?" I whispered. "I don't know," Scott replied, his voice tight with tension. "But I've got the rifle in the back. Should I get it?" I hesitated. The creature hadn't made any aggressive moves towards us yet. It was just standing there, watching. But it was so big, so unnatural looking. If it decided to attack, I wasn't sure a rifle would even stop it. Maybe just have it ready," I said. "But don't shoot unless we have to." Scott nodded and reached behind the seat, pulling out his hunting rifle. He checked that it was loaded and then laid it across his lap, pointed towards the floorboard. We sat there in tense silence for several long minutes. The creature remained motionless except for occasionally tilting its head as if studying us. That horrible ammonia smell was seeping into the truck cab, making my eyes water. Suddenly, the thing took another step towards us, then another. Its gait was odd, kind of a smooth gliding motion despite its massive bulk. It moved with an unsettling grace. "Oh, God," I whimpered. "Scott." He gripped the rifle tighter, but didn't raise it. "It's okay," he said. though his voice was shaking. "We're safe in here. It can't get to us." But as the words left his mouth, the creature suddenly broke into a run, charging straight for the truck. I screamed and Scott swore, fumbling to bring the rifle up. Just as I was certain we were about to be attacked, the thing veered to the side at the last second. It loped past us, so close I could hear its heavy breathing and see the muscles rippling under its fur. The entire truck shook as it brushed past. Then, in a blink, it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the woods like a ghost. We sat there panting and stunned for several minutes. I kept expecting it to suddenly reappear, but there was nothing. Just the normal sounds of the summer night. Did that really just happen?" I finally managed to ask. Scott nodded slowly. Yeah, it did." He let out a shaky laugh. "Holy shit." We eventually worked up the courage to get out of the truck and go back inside the house. We woke up Tom and told him what happened. He was skeptical at first, thinking we must have seen a bear or something. But when we took him outside and he smelled that lingering chemical odor, he knew something truly strange had occurred. We called the sheriff's office the next day, but they didn't take us very seriously, said it was probably just some kids in a costume playing a prank. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was like nothing that should exist in this world. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and on edge. I kept thinking I saw movement in the woods or heard strange noises at night, but we never encountered the creature again. Life eventually went back to normal, but I've never forgotten that terrifying night. To this day, I have no explanation for what we experienced. Was it some kind of unknown animal, a creature from folklore come to life? I don't know. But I do know that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to remind us how small and vulnerable we really are. I still live on that same farm, and sometimes, on quiet summer nights, I find myself peering out into the darkness, wondering if those glowing eyes are out there, watching, wondering if that massive shape will come lumbering out of the trees once more. I hope I never see it again, but a part of me knows that it's still out there somewhere, waiting. Story 17. I didn't pay it much mind at first. This was farm country after all. Animals die, kids pull pranks, coyotes make all sorts of racket. But looking back now, I realize those were just the first signs of what was to come. It was a crisp fall afternoon when I decided to do some fishing at the creek that ran through my property. I grabbed my rod and tackle box and whistled for my dog, Max, to come along. He was a good boy, a big old German shepherd who'd been by my side for years. As we made our way down to the creek, I noticed Max seemed on edge. His ears were pricked up, and he kept looking around, sniffing the air. I figured he'd caught scent of a rabbit or something. We got down to my favorite fishing spot, a quiet bend in the creek lined with old sycamores. I baited my hook and cast my line, settling in on a fallen log. Max paced restlessly instead of lying down like he usually did. "What's got into you, boy?" I asked, reaching out to give him a scratch. But he shied away, which wasn't like him at all. That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the creek seemed to be flowing silently. An uneasy feeling crept over me. I reeled in my line, deciding maybe we should head back to the house. As I stood up, I saw Max staring intently at a stand of cedars across the creek. His hackles were raised, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Max, what is it, boy?" He wouldn't look at me, just kept staring and growling at those cedars. I peered at the trees, straining to see what had him so riled up. At first I didn't see anything unusual, but then I can't really describe what I saw. It was more a sense of movement, a shifting of shadows that didn't match the breeze. Something big, much bigger than a person. My heart started racing. I called to Max again, my voice shaking. "Come on, boy, let's go." He finally looked at me then, and I swear his eyes were full of fear. He let out a whine and took off running back towards the house. I stood there frozen for a moment, afraid to move. The shadows in the cedars seemed to pulse and writhe. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost hungry. That snapped me out of my daze. I dropped my fishing rod and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, chasing after Max. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I made it to the house, slamming and locking the door behind me. Max was huddled in the corner, whimpering. I grabbed my shotgun and peered out the window, half expecting to see some kind of monster bearing down on the house. But there was nothing there, just the quiet autumn afternoon, leaves drifting lazily in the breeze. It was like nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the day and night on edge, jumping at every little sound. But whatever it was never came near the house. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. Over the next few days, I heard more stories from my neighbors, sightings of a huge, hairy creature in the woods, livestock found mangled, strange howls in the night. I never saw it clearly myself, but I know what I felt that day by the creek. There was something out there, something that didn't belong in our world. The odd happenings continued for a few more weeks, and then nothing. It all stopped as suddenly as it had begun. No more sightings, no more dead animals, no more strange noises. It was like whatever had been there just vanished. To this day I can't explain what happened in Germantown that fall, but I know it was real. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the terror I felt when I heard that inhuman growl. I moved away from Germantown not long after. Couldn't stand to be there anymore, always wondering if that thing was still out there in the woods. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the memory of that day. The day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't go fishing anymore, and I never, ever go into the woods alone. Story 18. I still remember that summer evening in 1978 like it was yesterday. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across our backyard in Summit County. My sisters and I had been playing hide-and-seek all afternoon, giggling and running around the property as we tried to outsmart each other. I was 9 years old at the time, the middle child between my older sister Jenny, 11, and little Katie, 7. As dusk settled in, I found myself alone in the yard, searching for my sisters who seemed to have vanished. The air was thick and humid, filled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Our property backed up to a dense pine forest that always gave me the creeps at night. But in my determination to win the game, I pushed aside my fears and ventured closer to the tree line. "Jenny? Katie?" I called out, squinting into the dimness between the trees. No answer. I was about to give up and head inside when I caught a glimpse of movement just inside the forest. A dark figure darted between two pines about 20 feet away. My heart leapt. I was sure it was Jenny trying to trick me. "I see you!" I shouted triumphantly, breaking into a run. "You can't hide from me!" As I entered the forest, pine needles crunching under my sneakers, I realized how much darker it was under the thick canopy. The figure was still ahead of me, moving deeper into the woods. It was hard to make out details in the low light, but something seemed off about the way it moved. The stride was too long, the motions too fluid for my gangly 11-year-old sister. A chill ran down my spine as doubt crept in. What if this wasn't Jenny after all? But my curiosity overpowered my growing unease. I had to know what I was chasing. I pushed on, branches whipping past my face as I struggled to keep up. The forest seemed to grow denser with each step, the air becoming thick and oppressive. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Suddenly the figure halted in a small clearing up ahead. My steps faltered as I approached, heart pounding in my chest. As I drew closer, I realized with growing horror that this was definitely not my sister. The creature before me was massive, at least 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, but it was the face that made my blood run cold. Large, intelligent eyes reflected the fading daylight as they locked onto mine. The face was undeniably ape-like, with a pronounced brow and wide, flaring nostrils. I stood frozen, unable to move or even breathe as we stared at each other. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. Despite my terror, I was struck by how human those eyes looked. There was curiosity there, and something that almost looked like concern. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying me. I noticed its hands, huge things with opposable thumbs, hanging at its sides. One foot shifted slightly, and I saw that it stood on 2 legs like a person. My mind was reeling, unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot wasn't real, was it? A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and the spell was broken. The creature's head snapped up, alert to the new sound. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It started as a low rumble, almost like a large dog growling, but it grew in volume and changed in pitch until it became a haunting, warbling howl that echoed through the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my knees go weak. Before I could react, the creature turned and loped off into the forest with surprising speed and grace for its size. Within seconds, it had vanished into the gathering darkness, leaving me alone and terrified in the clearing. I don't remember how I found my way home. Everything was a blur of panic and confusion. I burst through the back door, sobbing hysterically, babbling about monsters in the woods. My parents tried to calm me down as I blubbered out my story between hiccuping sobs. To my shock, Jenny and Katie came running down the stairs, asking what all the commotion was about. They had been inside the whole time, having given up on hide and seek when I took too long to find them. My parents exchanged worried looks, clearly thinking I had an overactive imagination or had gotten spooked by shadows in the woods. They patiently explained that there was no such thing as Bigfoot, that I must have seen a bear or maybe a very tall man walking his dog. But I knew what I had seen. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved with such deliberate grace. This was no bear or random hiker. In the days that followed, I scoured the library for any information I could find on Bigfoot sightings. The details matched up eerily well with my own encounter. As the years passed, I never stopped thinking about that night. I would replay every detail in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the fear and awe I felt in that moment were too visceral to be a product of my imagination. I'm in my 50s now, with kids of my own. I've never told them about what happened that summer evening in 1978. How do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? But sometimes when we're camping or hiking, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. I don't know if it was truly a juvenile Bigfoot I encountered that night. The scientific part of my brain still struggles to accept the possibility, but I know what I saw, and the memory of it has stayed with me all these years. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that exist in the shadowy spaces between myth and reality. I caught a glimpse of one that night, and it changed me forever. I'll always wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in that clearing just a little longer, if I had tried to communicate somehow. But maybe it's better not knowing. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, living on only in the stories we tell and the questions that haunt us in the dark of night. All I know is that whenever I find myself in the woods as the sun is setting, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I hear that haunting howl echoing through the trees. Story 19. I was just 18 when it happened, camping with my dad in the backcountry of Custer County, Colorado. It was the summer of '98, and we'd driven out to this remote spot deep in the national forest for some father-son bonding time. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was to have that trip with him. But at the time, all I could think about was how much I'd rather be hanging out with my friends back home. We'd arrived late in the afternoon and set up our tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As night fell, we built a fire and grilled some hot dogs, talking about my plans for college in the fall. Dad was trying to give me advice about dorm life and studying, but I was only half listening, itching to get reception on my flip phone so I could text my girlfriend. Around midnight, we doused the fire and crawled into our sleeping bags. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to get comfortable on the hard ground. The woods were eerily quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle in the underbrush. Sometime in the early hours before dawn, I gave up on sleep and unzipped the tent, figuring I'd take a leak and maybe look at the stars for a bit. As soon as I stepped outside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was a strange heaviness to the air, like the atmosphere before a big thunderstorm. I was zipping up my jeans when I noticed an odd orange glow flickering between the trees off to my right. At first I thought it must be another camper with a lantern, or maybe even the embers of our fire somehow reigniting. But as I peered into the darkness, I realized it was coming from much further away, probably a quarter-mile down the old logging road we'd driven in on. "Hey, Dad," I whispered, poking my head back in the tent. "There's some weird light out here. Should we check it out?" He grumbled sleepily but crawled out to take a look. We stood there for a minute, both transfixed by the strange glow. It seemed to be moving slightly, bobbing up and down. "Probably just some idiot smoking," Dad said. "But we better make sure it's not a forest fire starting. Hop in the truck." We climbed into our old Ford pickup and started slowly down the rutted dirt road, headlights off so we wouldn't spook whoever it was. As we got closer, the light seemed to grow brighter, taking on an almost unearthly quality. It wasn't the warm flicker of flames, but a cold, alien radiance that made my skin crawl. Rounding a bend, we suddenly came upon a small rocky outcropping jutting up from the forest floor. And there, perched on top of the largest boulder, was something. In that first moment, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was vaguely man-shaped, but far too tall and oddly proportioned. The figure stood completely motionless, backlit by that bizarre orange glow which seemed to be emanating from its body. Dad hit the brakes, and we sat there, frozen in shock. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the thing slowly began to turn towards us. That's when I saw its eyes, two glowing orbs reflecting our headlights like a cat's, but much larger and filled with an unsettling intelligence. I'll never forget the way it moved as it rotated to face us fully. There was a fluid grace to its motions, but also something profoundly wrong and unnatural. Its limbs seemed too long, joints bending at impossible angles. When it was finally looking straight at us, I could make out more details of its form. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 7.5. The body was covered in dark, matted hair, with a vaguely ape-like face featuring a prominent brow ridge. But the proportions were all wrong for any known primate. The arms hung down nearly to its knees, ending in huge hands with wickedly curved claws. For several heart-stopping seconds, we just stared at each other. I felt pinned in place by that penetrating gaze, like a rabbit hypnotized by a snake. Then Dad gunned the engine, and we went tearing back up the road in reverse, tires spitting gravel. I twisted around in my seat, half expecting to see the creature bounding after us. But when I looked back, the outcropping was empty. The orange glow had vanished as if it had never been there at all. We didn't stop until we were back at our campsite. Dad leapt out and started throwing our gear into the truck bed while I sat there shaking, unable to process what I'd just witnessed. What? What was that thing? I finally managed to stammer out. Dad paused in his frantic packing and ran a trembling hand through his hair. I don't know, son. I truly don't know, but we're getting the hell out of here right now. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as we finished loading up and hit the main forest road. We drove in tense silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. As the adrenaline wore off, I started to wonder if maybe we'd overreacted. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs, or some kind of elaborate prank? We should go back, I said suddenly, in the daylight, just to see if there's any sign of whatever that was. Dad looked at me like I was crazy, but after a moment he nodded grimly. You're right. We need to know for sure. So we stopped for breakfast at a diner in town, giving the sun time to fully rise, then steeled our nerves and drove back out to that godforsaken spot in the woods. In the warm light of day, with birds chirping and squirrels scampering about, it was hard to believe the nightmare we'd experienced just hours before. We found the outcropping easily enough. At first glance, everything looked normal. But as we got closer, we noticed subtle signs that something had indeed been there. Several of the smaller rocks had been displaced, with fresh scrapes in the lichen. And right at the base of the largest boulder was a depression in the pine needles, as if something very heavy had recently stood there. What we didn't find were any clear tracks or hair samples, nothing that would definitively prove what we'd seen. We searched the surrounding area for over an hour, but came up empty-handed. Finally, we had to admit defeat and head home. On the long drive back, we tried to rationally discuss what had happened. Dad thought it might have been a previously undiscovered species of great ape, somehow surviving undetected in the Colorado wilderness. I was less convinced, haunted by that otherworldly orange glow and those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. We made a pact not to tell anyone else about our encounter. Who would believe us anyway? But that night changed both of us forever. Dad became obsessed with cryptozoology, spending his free time researching Bigfoot sightings and other unexplained phenomena. As for me, I could never look at the woods the same way again. To this day, I break out in a cold sweat whenever I see an orange light in the distance. I've run through that night in my head 1,000 times since then, trying to make sense of it all. Was it really some undiscovered creature, a paranormal entity, or just an incredibly vivid shared hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and an overactive imagination? All I know for certain is that something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation and shattered my understanding of what was possible in this world. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, is it still out there, watching and waiting in the darkness? Story 20. I'll never forget that day at Lost Lake. It was supposed to be a peaceful fishing trip, just me and nature. But what I saw there, it still haunts me to this day. It was early September 1996. I had a few days off work and decided to head up to Jackson County for some solitary fishing. Lost Lake was my go-to spot, secluded, pristine, and usually good for rainbow trout. I arrived at the lake just as the sun was coming up, the mist still clinging to the water's surface. The air was crisp with that early fall chill. I found a good spot along the shore and set up my gear. For the first couple hours, everything was perfect. The fish were biting, birds were chirping, and I felt totally at peace. Around mid-morning, I decided to move to a different area of the lake. As I was packing up my tackle box, I heard a loud snapping sound from the tree line behind me. My first thought was, bear. We get a lot of black bears in that area, and I always carry bear spray just in case. I slowly turned around, scanning the forest edge. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by some pine trees, was something. At first glance, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But as I focused on it, I realized this was no bear. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. And the proportions were all wrong for a bear. It had long, muscular arms that hung down almost to its knees. The body was covered in dark, shaggy hair, maybe 3-4 inches long. But the face, that's what really got me. It had a face unlike anything I've ever seen, kind of ape-like, but not quite. The head was oddly shaped, almost conical, with a pronounced brow ridge. And the eyes, they were dark and deeply set, but unmistakably intelligent. Those eyes are seared into my memory. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The creature didn't move either, it just watched me intently. I got the sense it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Then, without warning, it turned and started moving away. But the way it moved, it wasn't the lumbering gait of a bear. This thing was fast and agile, covering ground quickly despite its bulk. It disappeared into the trees within seconds. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real, right? There's no way something like that actually exists. But I knew what I saw. It was as real as the ground beneath my feet. Once the initial shock wore off, I started to feel vulnerable. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, and I was alone in the wilderness. I hastily gathered my gear, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made me jump. As I hurried back to my truck, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The sheer size of the creature was astounding. I'm 6'2", and about 220 pounds, and this thing dwarfed me. I'd estimate it weighed at least 300 pounds, probably more, and the way it moved, so quick and fluid for something so large. I made it back to my vehicle without incident, but I was a nervous wreck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing emerging from the trees behind me. The drive home was a blur. My mind was in overdrive, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Could it have been a person in a costume? No. The movement was too natural, too fluid. A bear standing upright? Definitely not. The proportions were all wrong. Plus, those eyes, they were too intelligent, too aware. When I got home, I didn't know what to do. Who could I tell? Who would believe me? I thought about calling the police or Forest Service, but what would I say? Hi, I just saw Bigfoot. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. I spent the next few days in a daze. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature staring back at me. I scoured the internet for information, looking at every blurry photo and shaky video of alleged Bigfoot sightings. None of them did justice to what I'd seen. After about a week, I decided to go back. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to know if it was real. Maybe in the light of day, with a clear head, I'd realize it was just my imagination running wild. I went back to Lost Lake, this time armed with a camera. I spent the entire day there, hiking around the lake, searching the surrounding forest. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. No tracks, no hair, no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. Part of me was relieved. Maybe it had just been a bizarre hallucination brought on by dehydration or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I saw was real. In the years since, I've gone back to Lost Lake dozens of times. I've never seen the creature again, but I always feel like I'm being watched when I'm there. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. or hear a strange sound echoing through the trees, but nothing concrete. I've thought about sharing my story before, but I always chickened out. Who would believe me? I'm just a regular guy who likes to fish. I'm not some Bigfoot hunter or paranormal investigator. I don't have any proof, just my memory of that day. But I know what I saw. It was real, it was there, and it changed my life forever. I still fish, still spend time in the outdoors, but I'm always on alert now, always aware that there might be things out there we can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests of Colorado. Does it remember me? Does it ever think about our brief encounter? I'll probably never know. But I'll never forget those few moments when our eyes met, and I realized the world was a much stranger place than I'd ever imagined. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself, but I know what I saw that day at Lost Lake. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never shake the memory of those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at me from a face that shouldn't exist. Story 21. I'll never forget that chilly morning in September 1997 when I visited Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument in Teller County, Colorado. I had always been fascinated by paleontology, so I was excited to explore the area known for its incredible fossil deposits. Little did I know that I'd encounter something far more mysterious than ancient plant and insect remains that day. I arrived at the park just as it opened, eager to beat the crowds and enjoy some solitude among the petrified redwood stumps and shale outcrops. The air was crisp and damp from an overnight rainstorm, and wispy tendrils of fog still clung to the ponderosa pines. As I set out on one of the interpretive trails, I noticed how the wet ground was perfect for spotting animal tracks. At first, I was delighted to see the distinctive hoof prints of elk meandering across the path. But as I continued along, something caught my eye that made me stop in my tracks. Overlapping the elk prints were absolutely massive, bare humanoid footprints. I'm talking easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes clearly visible in the soft mud. My heart started racing as I crouched down to examine them more closely. These weren't just some random indentations or weirdly shaped puddles. The anatomical details were uncanny. You could see how the weight had pressed into the soil, leaving deeper impressions at the heel and ball of the foot, and the stride length between prints was huge, much longer than any person could make. I found myself glancing nervously at the surrounding forest, half expecting to see some hulking figure lurking in the shadows. But the woods were quiet, except for the occasional bird song. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Pulling out my camera, I snapped a few photos of the prints. Looking back, I wish I had thought to place something next to them for scale, but in the moment, I was too shocked and unsettled to think clearly. As I continued down the trail, I kept seeing more of the massive footprints intersecting with various animal tracks. They seemed to meander aimlessly, not following the designated path. At one point, they led right up to a petrified stump, as if whatever made them had stopped to examine it. After about 20 minutes, the prints veered off into a densely wooded area where I couldn't follow. By this point, my mind was reeling. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in cryptids or anything like that. But I also couldn't deny the evidence right in front of my eyes. Those footprints were real, and they were clearly made by something bipedal with feet twice the size of a normal human's. I practically jogged back to the visitor center, eager to report my find to a park ranger. When I breathlessly recounted what I'd seen to the guy at the front desk, his reaction was not at all what I expected. He just chuckled and said, "Sounds like you had a run-in with our local Bigfoot. We get reports of strange tracks now and then. There's even Bigfoot crossing signs on some of the nearby roads." I must have looked completely dumbfounded because he quickly added, "I'm just kidding about the Bigfoot part, of course. But yeah, we do sometimes get unusual tracks reported after rainstorms. Could be a bear walking on its hind legs, or even someone playing a prank." Hard to say without seeing them myself. He offered to go check out the location I described, but warned me that the prints had likely already been obliterated by other visitors if they were in a high-traffic area. Sure enough, when we returned to the spot about an hour later, there was no trace of the giant footprints I had seen. Just normal hiking boot treads and animal tracks. The ranger was sympathetic, but clearly skeptical of my story. He jotted down some notes in a logbook, probably just to humor me. I got the impression this wasn't the first time someone had come to him with a wild tale of mysterious creatures. As I drove home that afternoon, I couldn't stop replaying the morning's events in my head. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was it all just an elaborate hoax? Or could there actually be some unknown hominid species roaming the Colorado wilderness? In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the internet for any similar reports from the Florissant fossil beds area. I found a few vague accounts of hikers hearing strange vocalizations or glimpsing large, dark figures moving through the trees, but nothing as concrete as the tracks I had encountered. I even reached out to some Bigfoot research groups, sharing my photos and experience. Most were excited by my report, but a few more skeptical researchers pointed out that the prints could potentially have been faked using wooden foot-shaped stompers. It was a disheartening possibility I hadn't considered. 25 years later, I still don't know what to make of that morning in the fossil beds. The logical part of my brain says there has to be a mundane explanation. But another part of me can't let go of the visceral feeling I had standing there in the damp forest, staring at those massive, eerily human-like prints. I've returned to Florissant a handful of times since then, always with a mix of hope and trepidation. But I've never again encountered anything out of the ordinary. The mystery of those footprints remains unsolved, leaving me to wonder what secrets might still be hidden in the ancient forests and fossil-rich hills of Teller County. I know this story probably sounds far-fetched to most people. If I hadn't seen those tracks with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But that experience fundamentally changed how I view the natural world and the possibility of undiscovered species. I'm not saying I'm a true believer in Bigfoot or anything like that. I just think we need to keep an open mind about what might be out there, hidden just beyond the edges of our scientific understanding. Sometimes I still have dreams about those footprints. In my sleep, I find myself back on that misty trail, following the tracks deeper and deeper into the wilderness. But instead of losing the trail like I did that day, in my dreams, I keep going until I come face to face with something. I always wake up before I can make out any details. Maybe that's for the best. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what I saw that morning in Florissant. But the memory of those massive footprints pressed into the mud will stay with me forever, a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world waiting to be uncovered. Story 22. I was out elk hunting with my buddy Tom in Jackson County, Colorado back in '96. It was during archery season, and we'd been scouting this clear-cut area for a few days. The mountains were beautiful that time of year, all decked out in fall colors. We'd set up our tent at the edge of the forest and spent our days quietly stalking through the woods, hoping to bag a nice bull elk. On this particular morning, we got up before dawn and hiked about a mile to our hunting spot. As the sun started to rise, casting long shadows through the trees, we positioned ourselves at the edge of a clearing. Tom and I split up a bit to cover more ground, staying within sight of each other, but far enough apart to scan different areas. The air was crisp and cool, and I remember the smell of pine needles and damp earth as I crouched down behind a fallen log. We'd been there for maybe an hour, barely moving, when I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was Tom shifting his position, but when I turned to look, I realized it was coming from the other direction. My heart started racing as I saw a large, dark figure slowly rising up from behind some brush about 50 yards away. For a split second, I thought it might be another hunter. But as the figure stood to its full height, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This thing was huge, way too big to be a person, and it definitely wasn't an elk or a bear. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The creature was at least 8 feet tall, maybe even 9, with a massive barrel-shaped chest and long arms that hung down past its knees. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair that looked matted and shaggy. But it was the face that really got to me. It had a sloped forehead and a heavy brow ridge with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the early morning light. The nose was wide and flat, and the jaw jutted out prominently. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 30 seconds, the creature just stood there, slowly turning its massive head to scan the clearing. I could see its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. I was downwind, and I prayed it wouldn't catch my scent. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of turning its whole body, it would twist at the waist, using the momentum of its upper body to pivot. It was almost like watching a tree trunk swaying in the wind. I wanted to call out to Tom to make sure he was seeing this too, but I was paralyzed with fear. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Was this some kind of mutant bear, a hoax, or could it really be Bigfoot? Just as I was working up the courage to try and signal Tom, the creature's head snapped in my direction. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't quite human either. There was an intelligence there, a spark of something that sent chills down my spine. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had spotted me, but then it turned away, and with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, it melted back into the dense aspen forest behind it. As soon as it was gone, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto my bow. I turned to look for Tom, and saw him staring wide-eyed in the direction the creature had gone, his face as pale as I'm sure mine was. We didn't say a word. We just looked at each other, both of us trying to process what we'd just seen. After a few minutes, Tom jerked his head in the direction of our camp, and I nodded. We got out of there as fast as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. Back at the campsite, we finally started talking, our words tumbling out in a rush as we compared notes. Tom had seen it too, every impossible detail. We debated whether to report it, but who would believe us? 2 guys out in the woods, probably drinking. We weren't, but that's what people would assume. We'd be laughed out of town. We packed up our gear and left that same day, cutting our hunting trip short. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. But I knew what I'd seen. In the years since, I've done a lot of research on Bigfoot sightings. I've read about the Patterson-Gimlin film and other famous encounters, but nothing I've found quite matches what Tom and I saw that day. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. But then I'll catch up with Tom, and we'll share a look, and I know it was real. We don't talk about it much anymore. People tend to get uncomfortable or skeptical when we bring it up. But I know what I saw out there in those Colorado woods. I still go hunting, but never alone. And I always keep my eyes peeled, scanning the tree line. Part of me hopes I'll never see anything like that again. But another part of me wonders what would happen if I did. That day changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there we can't explain, creatures that defy our understanding of the natural world. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself staring out the window, wondering if somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Rockies, that creature is still roaming free. And I wonder if it remembers me too, the human it locked eyes with on that crisp autumn morning so many years ago. I've never been able to shake the feeling that there was more to that encounter than just a random sighting. The way it looked at me, it was like it was trying to communicate something. Not with words, but with its presence alone. Like it was saying, "I'm here. I exist. Remember this." And I have. Every day since then, I've carried that memory with me. It's shaped the way I see the world, made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and reality itself. I've gone back to Jackson County a few times over the years, always with the hope and fear of seeing it again. But the woods have remained silent, the creature elusive. Maybe it's moved on to more remote areas, driven away by encroaching civilization. Or maybe it's still there, watching and waiting, choosing carefully when to reveal itself. Whatever the case, that encounter in '96 remains one of the most profound experiences of my life. It's a reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, and that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. So if you're ever out in the wilderness, keep your eyes and your mind open. You never know what you might see. And if you do happen to encounter something you can't explain, remember, you're not alone. There are others out there who have seen the impossible, who have stared into the eyes of the unknown and come back changed. As for me, I'll keep telling my story, even if most people don't believe it, because I know the truth. And somewhere out there, in the deep forests of Colorado, I believe that creature knows it too. Story 23. The morning started off like any other on my trip. I woke up early, made some coffee over my little camp stove, and decided to do some wildlife watching. I grabbed my binoculars and hiked up to a ridge overlooking the valley. It was a beautiful, clear day, perfect for spotting elk, deer, or maybe even a bear if I was lucky. I'd been scanning the valley for about an hour when I noticed a group of hikers in the distance. They were moving along one of the popular trails, laughing and chatting, with a dog running ahead of them. I smiled to myself, thinking how nice it must be to share this beautiful place with friends. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. In the corner of my field of vision, I caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving through the trees. I quickly adjusted my binoculars, trying to get a better look. What I saw next made my blood run cold. It was huge, easily over 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and it moved on 2 legs with an eerie grace that seemed impossible for something of its size. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could see its arms swinging as it walked, far longer than any humans. The creature was moving parallel to the hiking group, keeping its distance but clearly aware of their presence. What struck me most was how fast it was moving. Despite its size, it covered ground much quicker than the hikers, effortlessly navigating the rough terrain. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars steady. Part of me wanted to look away, to convince myself it was just a bear or some other explainable animal. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sight. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 5 minutes, I watched this thing as it moved through the valley. It seemed to be deliberately staying out of sight of the hikers, using the trees and terrain for cover. Not once did the group or their dog seem to notice it, which seemed impossible given its size. As I watched, my mind racing, the creature approached a small stream. I held my breath, expecting it to stop or maybe even turn back. But without hesitation, it waded through the water, barely slowing its pace. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not quite human, but not like any animal I knew either. Just as I was considering whether I should try to alert the hikers somehow, the creature reached the edge of the forest on the far side of the valley. In a matter of seconds, it disappeared into the thick trees, leaving no trace of its passage. I lowered my binoculars, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't process what I'd just seen. It defied everything I thought I knew about the wildlife in these mountains. I'd heard stories, of course. Every hiker has heard tales around the campfire of Bigfoot sightings, but I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive dark figure emerge again. But there was nothing. That night, as I lay in my tent, sleep eluded me. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, and my imagination ran wild. What if it was out there, watching my campsite? What if it decided to investigate? I clutched my flashlight like a lifeline, ears straining for any unusual noises. The next morning, I packed up my camp in record time. As much as I'd been looking forward to this trip, I couldn't stand the idea of spending another night out there. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. Once I got home, I spent hours online, searching for any similar sightings in the area. I found a few vague reports, but nothing that matched the detail of what I'd seen. I considered reporting it myself, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I was the one who saw it. It's been years now, and I've never gone back to that valley. I still go camping and hiking, but never alone, and never in that part of Colorado. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye, and for a split second, I'm back on that ridge, watching that impossible creature move through the trees. I don't know what I saw that day. Maybe it was a Bigfoot. Maybe it was something else entirely. What I do know is that it changed the way I see the world. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know about nature and reality. To this day, I haven't told many people about what I saw. It's not the kind of thing you can just bring up in casual conversation. But I know what I witnessed, and it's a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I find myself wondering, if I saw it once, how many other times has it been out there, watching from the shadows, just beyond the edge of our awareness? I don't have any answers, just questions that I suspect will never be fully resolved. All I can say is this: if you're ever out in the wilderness, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. Story 24. We'd set up our camp earlier that day in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. It was a crisp autumn night with a bright moon hanging low in the sky. Tom and I were sitting by the campfire, sipping whiskey and sharing stories like we always did. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows across our faces. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 10 p.m. We were debating whether to turn in for the night or have one more drink when suddenly the entire forest seemed to come alive with sound. It started as a low rumble that I could feel vibrating in my chest. Within seconds, it built to a deafening, bone-chilling scream that echoed through the mountains. I've been hunting these woods for over 20 years, and I've never heard anything like it. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a mountain lion or the howl of a wolf pack. This was something else entirely, deep and guttural, yet piercing at the same time. It sounded almost human, but distorted and amplified to an impossible volume. The sheer power of it froze us in our tracks. Tom and I locked eyes across the fire, both of us too stunned to speak. The sound seemed to go on forever, though it probably only lasted 5 to 10 seconds. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. It took a few moments for my brain to start working again. "What the hell was that?" I finally managed to choke out. Tom just shook his head, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know, man, but it came from that direction." He pointed towards a ridge about half a mile from our camp. We debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to grab our rifles and go investigate, but a primal fear kept me rooted to the spot. What if whatever made that sound was still out there? What if it came back? We ended up staying awake most of the night, huddled close to the fire with our backs to each other, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. But we never heard the scream again, and nothing approached our camp. When dawn finally broke, we packed up our gear in record time and got the hell out of there. The drive back to civilization was tense and mostly silent. We tried to rationalize what we'd heard. Maybe it was some kind of weird atmospheric phenomenon, or a bear with a sore throat. But deep down, we both knew it was something we couldn't explain. For years afterwards, I dismissed the incident as a bizarre but ultimately natural occurrence. I told myself it must have been a mountain lion, even though I knew that wasn't quite right. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that I started to question that explanation. I was browsing YouTube late one night and stumbled across a video titled Bigfoot Screams Compilation. I clicked on it mostly out of curiosity and skepticism, but as I listened to the various recordings, my blood ran cold. One of them, supposedly recorded in the Pacific Northwest, sounded eerily similar to what Tom and I had heard that night in Colorado. Since then, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot encounters and vocalizations. I'm not saying I'm a full believer now, but I can't deny the similarities between what we experienced and what others have reported. The power, the volume, the almost human but not quite quality of the sound, it all fits. I've tried reaching out to Tom to see if he remembers that night the same way I do, but we lost touch years ago. Part of me wonders if he's had the same realization I have, or if he's still chalking it up to a mountain lion. Sometimes I lie awake at night, replaying that scream in my head. It's been over 25 years, but I can still hear it clear as day. The raw power and otherworldliness of it still sends chills down my spine. I find myself wondering, what if we had investigated that night? What might we have found on that ridge? But then I remember the primal fear that kept us rooted to our campsite, and I think maybe it's better we didn't go looking. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures are better left undisturbed in the wild places of the world. I haven't been back to Fall Creek Basin since that trip. I still hunt, but I stick to more populated areas now, and I always make sure to bring an extra powerful flashlight and some noise-canceling earbuds just in case. You never know what's out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I catch myself straining to hear that sound again. Part of me hopes I never do, but another part wonders if it would bring some closure to the mystery that's haunted me for decades. All I know for sure is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, and that night in Colorado, Tom and I came face to face, or at least ear to ear, with one of them. I've never shared this story publicly before. For years, I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up. But I know what I heard that night, and I know it wasn't anything I can explain. So I'm putting this out there in hopes that maybe someone else has had a similar experience. Maybe together, we can start to make sense of what's really out there in the wilderness. If you've ever heard something like this, or if you have any theories about what it could have been, I'd love to hear from you. Just maybe don't tell me if you've actually seen the creature that makes that sound. Some things I think I'm better off not knowing. Story 25. That particular night, I had a grueling statistics exam that went until almost 11 p.m. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home, so I took my usual shortcut through the park. It was a crisp October night, and the fall leaves crunched under my feet as I walked along the dimly lit path. The city lights of Boulder glowed in the distance. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I suddenly froze in my tracks. There, about 50 yards ahead of me, was a massive, dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line. At first I thought it might be a bear, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized this was something else entirely. The creature was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with an enormous, hulking frame. It had a small, pointed head, perched atop impossibly broad shoulders. The body was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. But the thing that struck me most was its posture. It stood in an odd, hunched position, almost like it was ready to sprint at any moment. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a car drove by on the nearby road, its headlights briefly illuminating the area. In that fleeting moment of light, I got a clearer glimpse of the creature's face. It had deep-set eyes that reflected an eerie reddish glow and a protruding, ape-like jaw. As soon as the car passed, the creature let out a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Then, in a movement far too quick and agile for its massive size, it turned and sprinted into the forest. The way it ran was bizarre, a loping, swinging gait that seemed both awkward and incredibly fast at the same time. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears for any sound of it returning. But the woods had fallen completely silent, not even the usual chirping of crickets or hooting of owls. It was as if every living thing was holding its breath. Finally, my fight-or-flight response kicked in, and I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back until I reached the well-lit streets near my apartment. I burst through my front door, locked it behind me, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. I spent the rest of that night huddled on my couch, every light in the apartment blazing, jumping at every little sound. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. But I knew deep down that this was no bear, no person in a costume. This was something other. The next day, I seriously debated whether to report what I'd seen. But who would believe me? I was a sleep-deprived college student. They'd probably assume I was drunk or on drugs, and part of me was terrified that if I spoke up, that thing might somehow find out and come for me. So I kept quiet. I avoided the park for weeks afterward, taking the long way home, even if it meant an extra 30 minutes of walking. I had nightmares about glowing red eyes and that bone-chilling growl. Even now, decades later, I get goosebumps thinking about it. Over the years, I've done a lot of research trying to make sense of what I saw that night. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptid encounters. Some details seem to match up: the height, the fur, the inhuman speed and agility. But nothing quite captures the sheer otherworldliness of what I witnessed. I've heard a few other stories from that area over the years, hikers claiming to have seen large ape-like creatures in the foothills or hearing strange vocalizations deep in the woods. But nothing as clear or as close as my encounter. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress and exhaustion of college somehow conjured up this vision. But then I remember the primal fear I felt in that moment, the way every hair on my body stood on end, the sheer wrongness of that creature's existence. And I know that what I saw was real, even if I can't explain it. I still live in Colorado, though I moved away from Boulder years ago. I love hiking and being outdoors, but to this day, I won't go into the woods alone at night. The memory of that encounter is seared into my brain, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear that growl again, echoing from the distant mountains. And I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another unsuspecting hiker to cross its path. I don't know if it was Bigfoot, or some unknown species, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw that night in Chautauqua Park, and it changed me forever. The world feels bigger now, more mysterious. And sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking silhouette once again. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was too afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed. But as I get older, I feel a need to share my experience, not to convince anyone or prove anything, but simply to add my voice to the chorus of unexplained encounters that hint at a world beyond our everyday understanding. To anyone reading this who might have had a similar experience, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, keep an open mind. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. I learned that lesson on a dark October night in 1995, and it's stayed with me ever since.